A Dog's Heart by Mikhail Bulgakov. Read by Alexander Terentiev. Chapter 1. Oh, just look at me. Look, I'm dying here. The blizzard's singing my last rites under the gate, and I'm howling along. I'm done for. I'm finished. That lout in the dirty cap, the cook from the Standard Diet Canteen for employees of the National Economic Council, he splashed boiling water over me and scalded me all down my left side. What a bastard! And him a proletarian, too. Oh, God Almighty, how that hurts. That boiling water's eaten right through to the bone. And now I'm left here howling away. But what good's howling going to do? Wasn't getting in his way, was I? Not going to eat the entire National Economic Council into ruin if I have a rummage in the rubbish tip, am I? Rotten, stingy swine. Just take a look at that fat, ugly mug of his sometime. Wider across than it is long, a real brazen-faced thief. Ah, people. It was midday when that lousy cook flung boiling water over me, and it's already dark now. Must be about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, going by the smell of onions from the Prechestinka Brigade fire station. The firemen have some kind of porridge for supper, you know that. But anyway, that's the last thing you'd really want, like mushrooms. Though some dogs I know from Prechestinka were telling me that the dish of the day people eat in the bar restaurant on the Glina Lane is mushroom in piquant sauce for 3 rubles 75 kopecks a serving. But that's an acquired taste for specialists. Might as well go licking a galoche. I can't bear this pain in my side. I can already see the way my career's headed, all right. There'll be open sores tomorrow, and the question is, how am I going to cure them? In the summer you can make a dash up to Sokolniki Park. There's a special kind of grass up there, really good, and apart from that you can get a free bellyful of sausage ends. The citizens dump a lot of greasy paper, that's good for a lick. And if it wasn't for that old bag up there in the circle in the moonlight singing Sweet Aida and making you feel miserable as sin, everything would be just grand. But now, in winter, where can you go? Had a few kicks up the backside, have you? You have. Caught a few bricks across the ribs, have you? You've seen plenty of that. I've been through it all, I can accept my lot, and if I'm crying now, it's not just from the physical pain and the cold, but because my spirit is dying. My dog's spirit is dying. Just look at my body, broken and battered now. People have abused it pretty badly, all right. The worst thing, though, is the way he lashed that boiling water over me, and it worked its way under the fur, so now I've got nothing left to protect my left side. As likely as not, I'll end up with pneumonia, and if I do, citizens, then I'll starve to death. What you're supposed to do with pneumonia is lie under the stairs in the front entrance, but while there's dogs lying around doing nothing, who's going to take my place running around the rubbish bins looking for food? I'll get a chill in my lung, I'll go crawling in my belly, I'll get weak, and any old-time specialist will be able to finish me off with a stick. And then the yard keepers with their badges will grab me by the legs and chuck me in their cart. Of all the proletarians, the lousiest shits are the yard keepers, the dregs of humanity, the lowest of the low. You get all sorts of cooks. Take the late Vlas from Prechestinka, for instance. The number of dogs' lives he saved. Because when you're sick, the most important thing is to grab a bite. And the old-timers say Vlas would fling you a bone, and there'd be more than 1/8 of a pound of meat on it. God rest his soul. He was a genuine character. Manor house chef to the Count's Tolstoy. Not from your Standard Diet Council. The things they do to decent food there at the Standard Diet are beyond a poor dog's comprehension. The villains use stinking salt beef for the cabbage soup, and those poor devils know nothing about it. They just come running, lap it up, gobble it down. One little typist, on 9th grade, she gets 45 rubles. Well, okay, her lover might give her a pair of fil-de-purse stockings, but then the humiliation she has to put up with on account of that fil-de-purse. He doesn't give it to her any normal kind of way. He makes her take his love the French way. Bastards, those French, if you want to know my opinion. Although they certainly know how to eat well, and everything with red wine, too. Yes. So this little typist comes running in after all. You can't go eating at the bar on 45 rubles. She hasn't even got enough for the cinema, and the cinema's a woman's only consolation in life. She shudders and screws up her face, but she gulps it down. Just imagine, 2 courses for 40 kopecks, and those courses, the 2 of them together, aren't even worth 15 kopecks, because the supply managers pocketed the other 25. And what good is that kind of feeding to her? She's got problems with the top of her right lung, and a woman's problem from all that French treatment. But they've deducted the money from her wages at work and fed her that rotten rubbish in the canteen. Here she comes, running into the gateway in her lover's stockings. Her legs are cold, she can feel the wind in her belly, because there is no fur covering it, and she's wearing cold panties, nothing but a lacy pretense. A flimsy rag for her lover. Just let her try putting on flannel ones, and he'll give her an earful. You look really grotesque. I'm sick of my Matriona. I've suffered enough with flannel pants. My time's come round now. I'm the chairman now, and everything I can steal goes on a woman's body, on crayfish tails, on our brow to sow champagne, because I had enough of going hungry when I was young. No more of that for me, and there isn't any life beyond the grave. I feel so sorry for her, I do. But I feel even sorrier for myself. It's not egotism that makes me say that. Oh, no. It's because our circumstances really are different. At least she's warm at home, but me, where can I go?
Here, boy. Sharik. Hey, Sharik. What are you howling at, you poor thing? What have they done to you? Ah.
The dry blizzard witch rattled the gates and swiped her broomstick across the young woman's ear, tossed her skirt up to her knees, exposing the cream stockings and a narrow strip of badly laundered underwear, choked off her words, and smothered the dog in snow. God almighty, this weather! Oh, and my belly aches. It's that salt beef, And when's there going to be an end to all this? Putting her head down, the young woman hurled herself into the attack and burst through the gates. Once out in the street, she was twisted and wrenched and tossed about, and then swirled around in a snowy corkscrew, and she disappeared. But the dog was left in the gateway with the pain of his mutilated side. He pressed himself against the cold, massive wall, gasped for breath, and made up his mind that he was never going to leave that place. He was going to die right there in the gateway. Despair had laid him low. His heart was filled with such bitter torment, he felt so lonely and afraid that tiny dog's tears the size of goosebumps crept out of his eyes and dried up instantly. His damaged side was a mass of matted, protruding frozen clumps, with angry red spots of scalded skin showing between them. Cooks are so senseless, stupid, and cruel. Sharik, she'd called him. What kind of damn Sharik was he? A Sharik was roly-poly, well-fed and silly. A Sharik ate porridge and had happy pedigree parents. But he was gangling, tousled and tattered, a skinny scrounger, a dog without a home. But thanks for the kind thought anyway. Across the road, the door of a brightly lit shop slammed as a citizen appeared out of it. Definitely a citizen, and not a comrade. Or perhaps even, most likely, a gentleman. The closer he gets, the clearer it is that he is a gentleman. You think I'm judging by his coat? Rubbish. Lots of the proletarians wear coats now, too. Of course, the collars aren't like that. That goes without saying. But from a distance, you can still get them confused. It's the eyes you can tell from. You can't get them mixed up no matter how near or far. Oh, the eyes are a very telling thing, like a barometer. You can see everything. Whose soul is dry as a drought in the desert, who might just give you a poke in the ribs with his boot for no reason at all, and who's afraid of everything and everybody himself. That's just the kind of lackey it's fun to give a snap on the ankle. Afraid, are you? Then try this. If you're afraid, you deserve it. The gentleman confidently crossed the street in a swirl of blizzard and came towards the gateway. Yes, you can see it all.
This gent would never eat rotten salt beef, and if he was ever served any anywhere, he'd kick up a real scandal, right to the newspapers. I, Philip Filipovich, have been fed rubbish. Here he comes, getting closer and closer. This gent dines heartily and doesn't steal. He won't give you a kick, but he's not afraid of anyone because he's always well fed. He's a gentleman who works with his brain, with a little pointy French beard and a bushy, dashing grey moustache like French knights have. But there is a nasty smell from him flying on the blizzard. The smell of hospital. And a cigar. The question is, what the hell was he doing in a central farming co-op? Here he is now. What's he looking for? What could he have been buying in that lousy little shop? Isn't Hunter's Row good enough for him? What is it? Salami. Dear gent, if you'd ever seen what they make that sausage out of, you wouldn't even go near that shop. Give it to me instead. The dog gathered his remaining strength and with a desperate effort crawled out of the doorway onto the pavement. The blizzard cracked its rifle above his head, flapping the massive letters of a long canvas poster. Is rejuvenation possible? Of course it's possible. That smell rejuvenated me. Got me up off my belly, twisted my stomach that's been empty for 2 days into scalding waves of cramp. The smell that defeated the hospital. The heavenly smell of minced mare with garlic and pepper. I can tell, I know, the salami's in the right pocket of his fur coat. He's right above me. Oh, my lord and master. Look at me. I'm dying. Behold my servile soul, my dismal lot. The dog began crawling on its belly like a snake, weeping floods of tears. Just take a look at that cook's handiwork. But you'll never give it to me, I know. Oh, I know what rich people are like, all right. But really, what do you need it for? What do you need rotten horseflesh for? You won't find that kind of poison anywhere except in the Mosselprom shops. But you had breakfast today. You, a figure of global standing, thanks to those male sex glands. What's the world coming to, after all? Seems like it's too soon to die, and after all, despair is a sin. Nothing else left for it. I'll have to lick his hands. The mysterious gentleman leaned down towards the dog with a glint of the golden rims around his eyes and pulled a long white package out of his right pocket. Without removing his brown gloves, he unwound the paper, which the blizzard instantly seized and bore away, and broke off a piece of the salami, which was called Krakow Special, and he gave the piece to the dog. Oh, you unselfish individual.
Here, boy, the gentleman whistled and added in a strict voice. Take it, Sharik, Sharik.
Sharik again. They've christened me. Well, call me what you like, for this act of extraordinary generosity. The dog instantly ripped off the skin, sank his teeth into the Krakow Special with a sob and gobbled it down in a flash, choking on salami and snow until his eyes watered, because in his greed he very nearly swallowed the string. More, more. I'm licking your hand again, I am. I'm kissing your trousers, my benefactor.
That's enough for now.
The gentleman spoke as curtly as if he were giving orders. He leaned down to Sharik, looked searchingly into his eyes, and suddenly ran his gloved hand over Sharik's belly in an intimate, affectionate way.
Aha, a male, he declared significantly. No collar? That's excellent. You're the one I need. You follow me.
He clicked his fingers and whistled. Follow you? To the end of the world! Kick me with your felt boots if you like, I won't say a word! The street lamps were burning all the way along Prochestinka Street. The pain in his side was unbearable, but at times Sharik forgot about it, obsessed by a single thought. In all the hurly-burly, how could he avoid losing sight of that miraculous vision in the fur coat and find some way to express his love and devotion. He managed to express it about 7 times on the way along Prochestenka Street as far as Obukhov Lane. He kissed one high galosh at Murtvy Lane, and clearing the way, he frightened some lady so badly with his wild howling that she sat down on a low bollard, and he howled a couple of times to encourage the pity for himself. Some fake Persian swine of a cat emerged from behind a drainpipe and caught the scent of Krakow Special, even through the blizzard. Everything went black in front of Sharik's eyes at the thought that a rich eccentric who picks up wounded dogs in a gateway might just take this thief along too, and he would have to share the delicacy from Musselprom. And so he gnashed his teeth at the cat so fiercely that it gave a hiss like a fire hose full of holes and shot up the drainpipe to the first floor.
Get out of it!
There wasn't enough Musselprom for all the idle riffraff loitering along Prochestenka Street. The gentleman showed his appreciation of the dog's devotion right in front of the fire station, outside a window through which they could hear the agreeable growling of a French horn, when he rewarded the dog with a second piece, a little smaller, round about 20 grams. "Here, what a crank! Trying to lure me along. Don't you worry, I'm not going anywhere. I'll follow you anywhere you say."
This way.
Into Obukhov Lane? Do me a favour. We know all there is to know about that lane. This way? By all means. But no, if you don't mind. No. There's a doorman here, and there's nothing in the world worse than that, far more dangerous than a yard keeper. An absolutely detestable breed, worse than cats, a knacker in gold braid.
Don't be afraid, come on. Good day, Philip Filipovich. Hello, Fyodor.
This is some important character. My God, who have you thrown me in with now, my doggy destiny? What sort of person is this who can take dogs from the streets past doormen into a housing association building? Look at that rascal, not a peep out of him, not a twitch. Sure, his eyes look sulky, but under that cap band with the gold braid he's not really bothered much. Like this is the way it's supposed to be. He's showing respect, gentlemen. Real respect. Right then, I'm with him, and I follow him. Making a move? Go to hell. I could just take a snap at your callous proletarian foot. For all the humiliation I've had from your kind, how many times have you smashed me in the face with a broomstick, eh?
Come on, come on.
We understand all right, no need to worry yourself. Where you go, we go. You just lead the way, and I won't fall behind, not even with this desperate pain in my side. Down from the staircase.
Were there any letters for me, Fyodor?
Respectfully up the staircase.
Not a one, Philip Filipovich. But they've moved some new housing association tenants into apartment 3.
The grand benefactor of dog-kind swung around sharply on a step, glanced down over the banisters, and asked in horror.
Well?
His eyes were big and round, and his moustache was bristling. The doorman down below craned his neck, set his hand to his lips, and confirmed it.
That's right. 4 of them there are. My God, I can't imagine what's going to happen in their apartment now. And what are they like? Don't seem too bad, sir. What about Fyodor Pavlovitch? He's going to get some screens and bricks. He's planning to put up partitions. What a damnable business! They're going to move them into all the apartments, Philip Filipovich, apart from yours. There's just been a meeting. They passed a motion, a new housing association committee. Sent the old lot packing. What are things coming to? Ay, ay, ay.
I'm hurrying as fast as I can. If you'd be good enough to look, you'd see my sides giving me trouble. Allow me to lick your boot. The doorman's gold braid was left behind and below. On the marble landing there was a quick breath of warmth from the pipes. They turned another corner, and there was the grand first floor, the piano nobile. Chapter 2. There is absolutely no point in learning to read when you can smell meat from a verst away anyway. But even so, If you live in Moscow and have any kind of brains in your head at all, you'll learn reading willy-nilly, and without any evening classes either. Of all the 60,000 dogs in Moscow, only some total idiot couldn't put together the letters to make the word salami. Sharik began learning by colours. He was only just 4 months old when they hung greenish-blue signs all over Moscow with the words MSPO, meat sales. Let us repeat, this is all pointless because you can smell the meat anyway. And once there was a real mix-up, when engine exhaust fumes had played havoc with Sharik's sense of smell. Taking his lead from the acrid bluish colour instead of a meat shop, he wandered into Golubitsino Brothers' electrical accessories shop on Mysnitska Street. At the brothers' place, the dog got a good taste of insulated wiring, and that stings worse than any cab driver's whip. This portentous moment should be regarded as the beginning of Sharik's education. Back out on the pavement, Sharik was already beginning to grasp that blue does not always mean meat. And as he squeezed his sore and smarting tail between his back legs and howled, he recalled that on all the meat shops the first mark on the left was a sprawling gold or reddish shape that he thought looked a bit like a sledge. M. After that he made even better progress. He learned that the SH in Moss Fish on the corner of Makhavaya Street, and then the I, it was more convenient for him to come running in from the tail of the word fish, because there was always a militiaman standing at the beginning. Little square tiles facing the corner spots in Moscow always invariably meant cheese. The black tap of the pot-bellied samovar that came at the front of the word signified his former master, Shishkin, mountains of Dutch red, brutish shop assistants who hated dogs, sawdust on the floor, and Backstein cheese with a rotten smell. If they were playing their accordion, which was not much better than Sweet Aida, and there was a smell of sausages, the first letters on the white posters formed themselves very conveniently into the phrase "no swear," which meant no swearing or tipping allowed. Sometimes here fights would flare up and spread rapidly, and people got punched in the face, though only in rare cases, but they always lashed at dogs with their napkins and their boots. If there were stale joints of ham hanging in the windows and heaps of mandarins, it was a grossus. If there were dark bottles of bad liquid, that was wine. The former Yeliseyev Brothers' shop. The unknown gentleman who had dragged the dog to the doors of his luxurious apartment located on the Piano Nobile rang the bell, and the dog immediately raised his eyes to the large black plaque with gold letters hanging at one side of the wide door glazed with wavy pink glass. He put the first 3 letters together straight away. P-R-O, pro. But after that there was some rotten thing with branches like a tree. He had no idea what that meant. Couldn't be a proletarian, could he? Sharik thought in amazement. That's not possible. He lifted up his nose, took another sniff at the fur coat, and thought reassured, no, not a whiff of a proletarian there. It's some learned word. God only knows what it means. Behind the pink glass a sudden joyful light blazed up, casting the dark plaque into even darker shadow. The door opened without making any sound at all, and a beautiful young woman in a white apron and lace cap appeared in front of the dog and his gentleman. The dog was bathed in a wave of heavenly warmth, and caught the scent of lily-of-the-valley from the woman's skirt. Right, that's the tops, that I understand, the dog thought. After you, Mr. Sharik, the gentleman said ironically, and Sharik proceeded reverently, wagging his tail. The splendid hallway was cluttered by a huge number of items. Sharik was instantly impressed by the mirror stretching right up to the ceiling, which immediately reflected a second Sharik, dog-tired and dilapidated, the terrifying reindeer's horns way up high, the countless fur coats and galoshes, and opal tulip with electric light in it in the ceiling. "Wherever did you find such a creature, Philip Philippovich?" the woman asked with a smile as she helped remove his heavy silver fox fur coat with a bluish gleam. "Good grief, what a mangy cur!" "Don't talk nonsense. Where is he mangy?" the gentleman asked with curt severity. With his coat removed, he was left in a black suit of English cloth, with a gold chain twinkling in subdued joy across his belly. Wait a moment, don't fidget. Stop fidgeting, you little fool. That's not mange. Hey, stand still, you devil. Aha, that's a burn. What scoundrel scolded you like that, eh? Stand still, will you? A convict cook, a cook, the dog said with its plaintive eyes and howled gently. Zina, the gentleman ordered, take him straight into the examination room and bring my surgical coat. The woman whistled and snapped her fingers, and after a moment's hesitation the dog followed her. The two of them entered a narrow, dimly lit corridor, walked past one lacquered door, reached the end, then turned left and found themselves in a dark little room, to which the dog took an instant dislike because of the ominous smell. The darkness clicked and was transformed into blinding day, and on every side things glittered, shone, and glared white. "Oh, no," the dog wailed to himself. "Sorry, but I won't let you. Now I understand. Damn them and their salami to hell. They've lured me into a dog's clinic. Now they'll make me drink castor oil and rip my side to shreds with knives, when it already hurts too much to touch anyway." "Oh, no, where are you going?" shouted the one they called Zina. The dog twisted around, coiled up like a spring, and suddenly smashed his undamaged side against the door so hard that the whack could be heard all through the flat. Then he flew back and started spinning around on the spot like a top under a whip, tipping over a white bucket and sending lumps of cotton wool spilling out across the floor. While he was spinning, the walls lined with cupboards full of gleaming instruments flitted round and round him, the white apron and contorted woman's face began jumping about. "Where are you going, you shaggy devil?" Zina shouted desperately. "You blasted nuisance!" "Where's their back staircase?" the dog was thinking. He took a run at random, bundled himself up and smashed into glass, hoping it might be a second door. Slivers of glass came showering out, clattering and tinkling, and out jumped a fat jar of some reddish bilge that instantly flooded the entire floor and started giving off a stink. The real door swung open. "Stand still, you brute!" the gentleman shouted, jumping around with one sleeve of his white coat pulled on, trying to grab the dog by the legs. "Zina, you hold him by the scruff of the neck, the rascal!" My goodness, what a dog! The door opened even wider, and another individual of the male sex entered the room wearing a white surgical coat. Crunching the broken glass as he went, the individual dashed across, not to the dog, but to the cupboard, opened it, and the whole room was filled with sweet, sickly smell. Then the individual dropped belly down straight onto the dog, and the dog fervently sank his teeth into him above the laces of his boot. The individual gasped, but kept his presence of mind. Some nauseating muck choked off the dog's breathing. His head started to spin. Then his legs gave way, and he skidded off crookedly to one side. "Thank you. This is the end," he thought dreamily, toppling over straight onto the sharp splinters of glass. "Farewell, Moscow. I'll never see Shishkin or any proletarians or Krakow sausage again. I'm going up to heaven for all my doggy sufferings. Oh, brothers, you knackers, why are you doing this to me?" And at that point he finally tumbled right over onto his side and croaked. When he rose again from the dead, his head was spinning slightly and he had a vaguely sick feeling in his stomach. But it was as if there'd never been anything wrong with his side. It was sweetly silent. The dog opened his languid right eye, and out of the corner of it he saw that he was tightly bandaged across his ribs and his belly. "They've done a job on me anyway, the sons of bitches," he thought vaguely. "But they've done a good job. To be fair, I've got to give them that." From Seville to Granada, in the dark silence of the night, an absent-minded voice started singing out of tune right above his head. Amazed, the dog opened both eyes completely, and just 2 steps away he saw a man's leg lying across a white stool. The trouser leg and long underwear on it were pulled up, and the naked yellow shin was smeared with dried blood and iodine. "Holy saints," thought the dog. "That must be where I bit him. I did that. They'll beat me now." You can hear the serenading and the clashing of the swords. Why did you bite the doctor, you tramp, hey? Why did you break the glass, The dog whimpered pitifully. All right, you've come round. Now lie still, you blockhead. Philip Filipovich, how did you manage to lure such a nervous dog in here? Asked a pleasant man's voice, and the underwear sprang back down into place. There was a smell of tobacco, and bottles started jangling in the cupboard. With kindness, the only possible way to deal with a living creature. Terror's useless for dealing with an animal, whatever level of development it might be at. I've always said that, I still say it, and I always will. They're wrong to think that terror will do them any good. No, sir. No, sir. It won't. No matter what color it is. White, red, or even brown. Terror totally paralyzes the nervous system. Zina! I bought this rascal some Krakow salami for 1 ruble and 40 kopecks. Make sure you feed him when he stops feeling sick. Pieces of glass crunched as they were swept up, and a woman's voice remarked flirtatiously. Krakow salami? Good Lord, you ought to have bought him offcuts for 20 kopecks at the meat shop. I could eat Krakow myself. Just you try. Eat it yourself indeed. It's poison for the human stomach. A big grown-up girl like you, and you still stick any old muck in your mouth like a child. Don't you dare. I warn you. Neither I nor Dr. Baumenthal will take any trouble over you when you get stomach cramps. All who dare say that another here compares with you. While this all went on, the entire apartment was filled with gentle staccato ringing sounds, and every now and then there was the sound of voices far away in the hallway. The telephone rang. Zina disappeared. Philip Filipovich dropped the butt of his papirosa into a bucket, buttoned up his white coat, smoothed down his bushy moustache in front of the little mirror on the wall, and called to the dog. All right, all right. We're going to see some patients now. But the dog stood up on unsteady legs, swayed and shivered, but quickly recovered and set off after Philip Filipovich's flapping coat hem. The dog crossed the narrow corridor again, only now he saw that it was brightly lit from above by a round rosette. But when the lacquered door opened and the dog walked into the luxuriously appointed study with Philip Filipovich, he was blinded by all the finery. First of all, the entire room was a blaze of light, burning on the moulded ceiling, burning on the desk, burning on the wall and in the glass panes of the cupboards. The light flooded over 1,001 different objects, the most intriguing of which was an immense owl sitting on a branch on the wall. Lie down, Philip Filipovich ordered. A carved door opposite the first opened, and in came the man who'd been bitten, looking very handsome now in the bright light, young, with a pointed little beard. He held out a sheet of paper and said, "A return patient." He immediately disappeared without another sound, and Philip Filipovich parted the skirts of his white coat, sat down at the immense desk, and suddenly became exceptionally solemn and imposing. No, this isn't a clinic. This is some other kind of place I've ended up in, the dog thought in confusion, and he collapsed onto the patterned carpet beside the heavy leather divan. And we'll get to the bottom of that owl, too. The door opened gently, and someone came in who startled the dog so much that he yelped, but very timidly. "Quiet! My, but I can hardly recognize you, my dear fellow." The new arrival bowed to Philip Filipovich in embarrassed respect. "You're a sorcerer, a wonder-worker, Professor," he said bashfully. "Take your trousers off, my dear fellow," Philip Filipovich ordered, standing up. "Lord Jesus Christ," thought the dog. "Just look at that freak." The freak's head was covered with hair that was entirely green and shot through with rusty tobacco color at the back. Wrinkles had spread right across the freak's face, but his complexion was as pink as a baby's. His left leg didn't bend at the knee, it had to be dragged across the carpet, but the right one skipped about like the leg on a child's toy nutcracker. A precious stone peered out like an eye from the lapel of his quite magnificent jacket. The dog was so fascinated that he even stopped feeling sick. "Oof, oof," he yelped gently. Quiet. How do you sleep, my dear fellow?
Are we alone, Professor?
It's indescribable, the visitor said shyly. Parole d'honneur. Nothing like it for 25 years. The fellow grasped the button of his trousers. Would you believe it, Professor? Every night, hordes of naked young women. I'm positively enchanted. You're a magician. Philip Filipovich hemmed absent-mindedly, gazing into his visitor's pupils. The visitor finally managed his buttons and removed his striped trousers to reveal drawers, the like of which had never been seen before. They were cream-coloured, embroidered with black silk cats, and smelled of perfume. The dog couldn't contain himself at the sight of the cats, and he barked, making the fellow jump. "Aye!" "I'll beat you. Don't be afraid, he doesn't bite." "I don't bite?" The dog thought in amazement. The visitor dropped a little envelope out of his trousers. There was a picture on it of a beautiful girl with her hair hanging loose. The fellow jumped, leaned down, picked her up, and blushed furiously. "You be careful now," Philip Filipovich said in stern admonishment, wagging a finger at him. "Just be sure you don't go overdoing it." I'm not over—" The subject muttered in embarrassment, continuing to get undressed. "I only tried it, dear Professor, for an experiment." "Well then, and what was the result?" Philip Filipovich asked sternly. The subject waved his hand ecstatically. I swear to God, Professor, nothing like it for 25 years. The last time was in 1899 in Paris, on Rue de la Paix." "And why have you gone green?" The visitor's face darkened. "That damned Gyrcast! You couldn't possibly imagine, Professor, what those good-for-nothings palmed off on me as dye. Just look at it," the fellow muttered, looking around for a mirror. "They deserve a sound beating," he added truculently. "What am I going to do now, Professor?" he whined. Shave your head to the skin." "Professor, it will grow grey again. And apart from that, I won't be able to show my face at work. And this is the third day I haven't gone already. Professor, if only you would invent a way to rejuvenate the hair, too." "One thing at a time, my dear fellow. One thing at a time," muttered Philip Filipovich. He leaned down, and his eyes glittered as he inspected his patient's naked belly. "Well now, that's charming. Everything's in perfect order. To be honest, I wasn't actually expecting quite such a good result. Much blood and many songs, much blood and many songs. Get dressed, my dear fellow." "I sing to her whose charms surpass them all." The patient joined in, with a voice that jangled like a frying pan, positively glowing as he started to get dressed. When he had made himself decent, hopping up and down and propagating the smell of perfume through the air, he counted out a bundle of white notes to Philip Filipovich and started shaking him affectionately by both hands. "You don't need to come for another 2 weeks," said Philip Filipovich. "But even so, please, be careful." "Professor!" the fellow's voice exclaimed in ecstasy from behind the door. "Don't worry about a thing." The voice giggled voluptuously and disappeared. A ringing sound jangled airily through the apartment. The lacquered door opened, the bitten one came in, handed Philip Filipovich a sheet of paper, and announced, "The age given is incorrect. Probably 54 or 55. The cardiac sounds are slightly muffled." He disappeared, and his place was taken by a rustling lady with her hat cocked dashingly to one side and a glittering necklace on her flabby, crinkly neck. She had terrible black bags under her eyes, and her cheeks were as rosy pink as a doll's. She was extremely nervous. "Madam, how old are you?" Philip Filipovich asked her very sternly. The lady was so frightened that she even blanched under her crust of rouge. "Professor, I swear, if only you knew what a drama—" "How old are you, madam?" Philip Filipovich repeated even more sternly. "My word of honour, well, 45. "Madam!" Philip Filipovich cried. "People are waiting for me. Don't delay them, please. You're not the only one. The lady's breast heaved violently. I'll only tell you as a luminary of science, but I swear, it's so terrible. How old are you? Philip Filipovich asked in shrill fury, and his spectacles glinted. 51, the lady replied, squirming in terror. Take your panties off, madam, Philip Filipovich said with a sigh of relief and pointed to a tall white scaffold in the corner. I swear, Professor, the lady muttered, unfastening some kinds of studs on her belt with trembling fingers, that this Alphonse, I speak to you as if you were my confessor. From Seville to Granada. Philip Filipovich began singing absent-mindedly and pressed the pedal of the marble washstand. There was a sound of running water. I swear to God, said the lady, and patches of live colour forced their way through the artificial ones on her cheeks. I know that this is my final passion. He's such a scoundrel. Oh, Professor, he's a card sharp. The whole of Moscow knows it. He can't resist a single vicious little milliner. After all, he's so devilishly young. The lady muttered and tossed a crumpled wisp of lace out from under her rustling skirts. The dog's head began feeling completely fuzzy, and everything in it began tumbling over and over. Well, damn the lot of you, he thought dimly, resting his head on his paws and slipping into a doze out of a sense of shame. I'm not even going to try to understand what's going on here. I won't understand it anyway. He was roused by a ringing sound and saw Philip Filipovich toss some kind of shiny little tubes into a basin. The lady with patchy cheeks was clutching her hands to her breast and gazing in hope at Philip Filipovich. He frowned solemnly, sat down at the desk and made a note of something. Madam, I'm going to implant a monkey's ovaries in you, he declared and gave her a stern look. Professor, are they really a monkey's? Yes, Philip Filipovich replied intransigently. When is the operation? The lady asked in weak voice, turning pale. From Seville to Granada. On Monday. You'll go into the clinic in the morning. My assistant will prepare you. I don't want to go into the clinic. Can't you do it here, Professor? Well, you see, I only perform operations here in extreme cases. It would be very expensive. 500 rubles. I accept, Professor. The water started tinkling again. A feathered hat fluttered, then a head as bold as a plate appeared and embraced Philip Filipovich. The dog was dozing, his nausea had passed. The dog was enjoying the soothing, calm feeling in his side and the warmth. He even took a short nap and had time for a brief fragment of a pleasant dream in which he ripped a whole bunch of feathers out of that owl's tail. Then an agitated voice yelped right above his head. I'm too well known in Moscow, Professor. What am I going to do? Good grief! Philip Filipovich exclaimed indignantly. This is impossible. You must control yourself. How old is she? 14, Professor. You understand, the publicity will ruin me. I'm supposed to receive a foreign assignment in a few days' time. Well now, I'm not a lawyer, my dear fellow. You can wait for 2 years and marry her. I am married, Professor. Ah, good grief, good grief. Doors opened, faces came and went, instruments rattled in the cupboard, and Philip Filipovich worked indefatigably. A bawdy apartment, thought the dog, but it's so good here. Only what the hell did he want me for? Is he really going to let me live here? What a crank! Why, with a blink of his eyes he could get himself the kind of dog that would knock spots off me. But then perhaps I am handsome. That must be my good fortune. But that owl's a vile creature, so high and mighty. The dog finally woke up completely late in the evening, when the ringing had stopped, at the precise moment when the door admitted some special visitors. There were 4 of them all at once. All young men, and all dressed very modestly. "What do these types want?" the dog thought in surprise. Philip Filipovich greeted his guests in a far more hostile manner. He stood beside the desk and looked at the people who had come in like a general, eyeing the enemy. The nostrils of his hawk-like nose flared. The newcomers shuffled their feet on the carpet. "We've come to see you, Professor," said the one who had a shock of thick, curly hair towering up almost 20 centimeters above his head, "concerning the following matter." "Gentlemen, you should know better than to walk around without galoshes in this weather," Philip Filipovich interrupted him in a didactic tone. "In the first place, you'll catch a cold, and in the second, you've trailed dirt across my carpets, and all my carpets are Persian." The one with the tall shock of hair fell silent, and all four of them gaped at Philip Filipovich in amazement. The silence lasted for several seconds, broken only by the tapping of Philip Filipovich's fingers against a painted wooden bowl on the desk. "In the first place, we're not gentlemen," the most youthful of the four, with a complexion like a peach, eventually declared. "In the first place," said Philip Filipovich, interrupting him as well, "are you a man or a woman?" The foursome fell silent again and opened their mouths wide. This time it was the first one, with the shock of hair, who recovered first. "What difference does it make, comrade?" he said haughtily. "I am a woman," the peachy youth in the leather jacket confessed, blushing deeply. For some reason the youth's blush was repeated rather intensely by another of the newcomers, a fair-haired man in a tall Astrakhan hat. "In that case you may keep your cap on, but I would request you, my kind sir, to remove your headgear," Philip Filipovich said forcefully. "I'm not your kind sir," the fair-haired man replied sharply, removing his hat. "We've come to see you," the man with the shock of black hair began again. "First of all, who's we?" "We're the new house committee for our building," the black-haired man said with restrained fury. "I am Schwanda, she is Vyazemskaya, he is Comrade Pistrukin, and he is Zharovkin. And so we—" "Are you the ones who have been moved into Fyodor Pavlovich Sablin's apartment?" "We are," replied Schwanda. "My God! Kolobukov House is done for!" Philip Filipovich exclaimed in despair, throwing his hands up in the air. "What do you find so funny, Professor?" Schwanda asked indignantly. "There is nothing funny about it. I'm in total despair," shouted Philip Filipovich. "Now what's going to happen to the steam heating?" "Are you making fun of us, Professor Preobrazhensky? On what business have you come to see me? Tell me as quickly as you can. I'm about to have dinner." "We, the administration of the building," Schwanda began with hatred in his voice, "have come to see you following a general meeting of the tenants in our building. The standing question at which concerned the consolidation of the apartments in our building." "Who was standing on whom?" shouted Philip Filipovich. "Make an effort to express your thoughts more clearly." "The question of consolidation was standing." "Enough! I understand. Are you aware that under the decree of 12th August my apartment is exempted from any and all consolidations and resettlements?" "We are," replied Schwanda. "But the General Assembly, having considered your case, has reached the conclusion that on the whole you're occupying an excessive area. Absolutely excessive. You live in 7 rooms on your own." "I live and work in 7 rooms on my own," replied Philip Filipovich. "And I should like to have an 8th. I need it badly for a library." The foursome were dumbfounded. "An 8th?" said the light-haired man, who was now hatless. "Now, that's a really good one." "This is unspeakable," exclaimed the youth who had turned out to be a woman. "I have a reception room, and note, that is also the library, a dining room, my study, that's 3, an examination room, 4, an operating theatre, 5, my bedroom, 6, and the servants' room, 7. Generally speaking, it's not enough. But anyway, that's not important. My apartment is exempt, and there's an end to the conversation. Now may I go and have my dinner?" "I'm sorry," said the 4th visitor, who looked like a sturdy beetle. "I'm sorry. Schwander interrupted him. "It is precisely on account of the dining room and the examination room that we have come to talk to you. The General Assembly requests you to give up the dining room voluntarily as a matter of labor discipline. Nobody in Moscow has dining rooms. Not even Isadora Duncan," the woman shouted resoundingly. A change came over Philip Filipovich, as a consequence of which his face began gently flushing crimson, and he waited without saying another word to see what would come next. "And the examination room, too," Schwander continued. "The examination room can perfectly well be combined with the study." "Ugh," Philip Filipovich said in a strange sort of voice. "And where am I supposed to take my food?" "In the bedroom," all four of them replied in chorus. Philip Filipovich's crimson tone acquired a rather greyish tinge. "Take my food in the bedroom," he said in a slightly muffled voice. "Read in the examination room. Get dressed in the reception room, operate in the servants' room, and examine people in the dining room. It's quite possible that Isadora Duncan might do that sort of thing. Perhaps she takes dinner in her study and sacrifices rabbits in the bathroom. Perhaps. But I am not Isadora Duncan," he bellowed abruptly, and his crimson tone turned to yellow. "I am going to dine in the dining room and operate in the operating theatre. Inform the General Assembly of that. And now I respectfully request you to go about your business and allow me to take my food where all normal people take it, that is in the dining room, not in the hallway and not in the nursery." "In that case, Professor, in view of your obstinate opposition," said the agitated Schwander, "we shall lodge a complaint about you at the highest levels." "Ah, is that so?" said Philip Filipovich, his voice assuming a suspiciously polite tone. "Would you mind waiting for just one moment?" "That's my kind of guy," the dog thought in delight. "Just like me. Oh, now he'll give them such a chomp. Oh, a really good snap. I don't know yet exactly how, but he'll get them all right. Bite them! Grab that long-legged one this instant just above the top of his boot, by the tendon under the knee. Rrrr." Philip Filipovich tapped on the phone, then picked up the mouthpiece and spoke into it as follows. "If you please. Yes. Thank you. Could I speak to Pyotr Alexandrovich, please? Professor Preobrazhensky. Pyotr Alexandrovich, I'm very glad to have caught you. Thank you, I'm very well. Pyotr Alexandrovich, your operation is being cancelled." "What?" "No, cancelled completely. And so are all the other operations. I'll tell you why. I'm discontinuing my activities in Moscow, and in Russia in general. A group of 4 people, one of them a woman dressed as a man, and 2 of them armed with revolvers, have just come to my apartment and terrorized me in an attempt to take part of it away from me." "Come now, Professor," Schwander began, his expression changing to dismay as he spoke. "I'm sorry, I am not able to repeat everything they said. I am no great lover of gibberish. Suffice it to say that they have suggested that I should give up my examination room, in other words, put me in the position of having to operate on you in the place I have previously used for sacrificing rabbits. Not only can I not work in such conditions, I have no right to do so. I am therefore discontinuing my activities, closing down the apartment, and leaving for Sochi. I can hand over the keys to Schwander. Let him perform the operation." The foursome froze. The snow was smelting on their boots. "What can I do? It is extremely distressing for me, too." "What? Oh, no, Pyotr Alexandrovich. Oh, no. I can't take any more of this. My patience is exhausted. This is the 2nd incident since August. What? As you wish. That would be something at least. But just one condition. Whatever you like, whenever you like, from whomever you like. But it has to be the kind of document that means that neither Schwander nor anyone else can even approach the door of my apartment. A definitive document. Factual. Authentic. armor-plated, without even any mention at all of my name. Of course. For them, I am dead. Yes, yes. By all means. From whom? Ah. Well, that's a different matter. Ah. Good. I'm just handing him the phone. Would you mind? Philip Filipovich said to Schwander and his servant's hiss. Someone would like to have a word with you. Come now, Professor, said Schwander, flushing and fading by turns. You have perverted our meaning. I would ask you, please, not to use such expressions. Confused and embarrassed, Schwander took the phone and said, Hello? Yes? Chairman of the House Committee. But we were acting in accordance with the rules. The Professor's position is already absolutely exceptional as it is. We know about the work he has done. We wanted to leave him an entire 5 rooms. Very well. In that case, all right. Completely red in the face, he put down the receiver and turned round. He cut them down to size. That's my boy, the dog thought admiringly. Does he know some special word or something, then? Well, now you can beat me as much as you like, but I'm not leaving. The other 3 gaped wide-mouthed at the castigated Schwander. It's a disgrace, Schwander said timidly. If there had been a debate just now, the woman began, growing agitated so that her cheeks blushed crimson, I would have demonstrated to Pyotr Alexandrovich. I'm sorry, perhaps you might care to open that debate this very moment? Philip Filipovich inquired politely. The woman's eyes blazed. I understand your irony, Professor. We'll be going now. Only, as the head of the building's cultural department, I would like to offer you... At this point, the woman pulled out several brightly coloured magazines wet with snow from under the front of her coat. The chance to buy several magazines to support the children of Germany, 50 kopecks each. No, I won't take any, Philip Filipovich replied curtly after squinting briefly at the magazines. Their faces expressed absolute amazement, and the woman's face bloomed cranberry red. Why won't you take any? I don't want them. Don't you sympathize with the children of Germany? I am indifferent to them. You think 50 kopecks is too much? No. Then why not? I don't want them. There was a brief silence. You know, Professor, the young woman said with a heavy sigh, if you didn't have a European reputation, and you hadn't been interceded for in the most outrageous fashion— The light-haired man tugged on the edge of her jacket, but she waved him away. By individuals whom I am sure we shall expose in their true colours in good time, you ought to have been arrested. And what for? Philip Filipovich inquired curiously. You hate the proletariat, the woman said fervently. Yes, I am not fond of the proletariat. Philip Filipovich agreed sadly and pressed a button. Somewhere a bell rang. The door into the corridor opened. Zina, called Philip Filipovich. Serve dinner. Would you mind, gentlemen? The foursome left the study in silence, walked through the reception room in silence, walked through the hallway in silence, and then there was the sound of the front door slamming resoundingly behind them. The dog stood up on his hind legs and performed a kind of salaam to Philip Filipovich. Chapter 3. Thinly sliced salmon and pickled eels lying on the plates decorated with designs in the colours of paradise inside a broad black border. A weeping piece of cheese on a heavy board and caviar in a silver tub heaped around with snow. Between the plates, several narrow spirit glasses and 3 small crystal carafes with different coloured vodkas. All of these items were accommodated on a little marble table, nestling cosily alongside an immense sideboard of carved oak, radiating powerful beams of light from its massed glass and silver. In the centre of the room stood a table as heavy as a tombstone, covered with a white tablecloth, and on that 2 place settings, napkins folded into the shape of papal tiaras and 3 dark bottles. Zina carried in a covered silver dish in which something was simmering and seething. When the dog caught the smell coming from the dish, its mouth immediately filled with liquid saliva. "The gardens of Semiramis," he thought, and started drumming on the parquet flooring with his tail as if it were a stick. "Bring them over here," Philip Filipovich commanded eagerly. "Dr. Bomental, I implore you, leave the caviar alone. And if you would like a piece of good advice, pour some plain Russian vodka, not the English kind." The handsome bitten one, he was without his white coat now, wearing a very presentable black suit, jerked his broad shoulders, grinned politely, and poured the transparent liquid. "The newly approved kind?" he inquired. "God bless you, dear fellow," his host replied. "That's pure spirit. Darya Petrovna makes excellent vodka herself." "Oh, come now, Philip Filipovich. Everybody agrees it's very decent vodka. 30%. "But vodka ought to be 40%, and not 30. That's in the first place," Philip Filipovich interrupted didactically. "And in the second place, God only knows what they've chucked into it. You tell me, what idea are they likely to get into their heads next?" "Anything at all," the bitten one said confidently. "And I am of the same opinion," Philip Filipovich added, tossing the contents of his glass down his throat at a single throw. Dr. Bomental, try this thing here instantly, and if you say that it's bad, then I am your mortal enemy for life. From Seville to Granada." And so saying, he himself picked up something that looked like a small, dark piece of bread on a goose-paw silver fork. The bitten one followed his example. Philip Filipovich's eyes sparkled. "Is that bad?" asked Philip Filipovich, chewing. "Bad? Answer me that, my dear doctor." "It's quite superb," the bitten one replied sincerely. "I should think so. Note, Ivan Arnoldovich, that only the landowners that the Bolsheviks haven't finished off yet take cold hors d'oeuvres and soup with their vodka. Any man who has the slightest respect for himself operates with hot hors d'oeuvres. And of all the hot hors d'oeuvres of Moscow, this is number one. Once upon a time, they used to prepare it magnificently in the Slavansky Bazaar. Here, you have some." "You're feeding the dog in the dining room," said a woman's voice. "It will take more than white bread to tempt him out of here after that." "Never mind, the poor creature's half-starved." Philip Filipovich offered the dog an hors d'oeuvre picked up on the tip of his fork with the same conjurer's agility, and dropped the fork into a slop basin with a clatter. After that, steam smelling of crayfish rose from the plates. The dog sat in the shade of the tablecloth with the air of a sentry at a gunpowder depot, and Philip Filipovich, having tucked the tail of a stiff napkin into his collar, pronounced, "Food, Ivan Arnoldovich, is a tricky business. You have to know how to eat, and just imagine, most people have no idea how to do it. You have to know not only what to eat, but when and how." Philip Filipovich brandished his spoon significantly. "And what to say while you're at it, yes, indeed. If you're concerned about your digestion, my best advice is not to talk about Bolshevism or medicine at the dinner table. And may God preserve you from reading the Soviet newspapers before dinner." But there aren't any others." "Then don't read any. Do you know, I have conducted 30 observations in my clinic, and what do you think? Patients who do not read the newspapers feel perfectly fine. Those whom I deliberately got to read Pravda lost weight." The bitten one responded with interest, turning pink from the soup and the wine. "And that's not all. Reduced knee reflex response, appalling appetite, depressed mental state. Damnation. Yes, indeed. But now what am I doing? I've started talking about medicine myself." Philip Filipovich leaned back in his chair and rang the bell, and Zina appeared in the cherry door curtains. The dog received a pale, thick piece of sturgeon, which he didn't like, and immediately after that a slice of bloody roast beef. After gobbling that down, the dog suddenly started feeling sleepy and realized that he couldn't bear the sight of any more food. "What a strange feeling," he thought, closing his sleep-weighted eyelids. "My eyes don't want to see any food at all, and smoking after dinner is stupid. The dining room filled up with disagreeable blue cigar smoke. The dog dozed, resting his head on his front paws. Saint-Julien is a decent wine, the dog heard through his sleep. Only now there isn't any. The sound of muffled choral singing came to them, softened by ceilings and carpets, from somewhere above and off to one side. Philip Filipovich rang the bell, and Zina came. "Zinushka, what on earth is the meaning of that?" "They've called another General Assembly, Philip Filipovich," Zina replied. "Again?" Philip Filipovich exclaimed mournfully. "Well, it looks like as if it's really started now. Kolobukov house is done for. I'll have to move away. But where to? That's the question. It will all go as smooth as butter. First singing every evening, then the pipes will freeze in the toilets, and then the steam heating boiler will burst, and so on. Curtains for Kolobukov." "Philip Filipovich is in mourning," Zina remarked with a smile as she carried away a heap of plates. "And I have good reason to mourn," Philip Filipovich cried. "What a house this used to be, you must understand." "You take too gloomy a view of things, Philip Filipovich," the handsome bitten one protested. "Things have changed quite remarkably now." "Dear fellow, you know me, don't you?" "You do. I'm a man of facts, a man of observations. I'm an enemy of baseless hypothesis, and this is very well known not only in Russia but even in Europe. And if I say something, that means it is based on some fact from which I draw a conclusion. And here is a fact. The coat rack and galosh stand in our house." "That's curious." "Galoshes? That's nonsense. Galoshes don't bring happiness," the dog thought. "But he's a really outstanding individual." "Let us take, for example, the galosh stand. I've lived in this house since 1903, and in all that time, until March 1917, there was not a single case, let me underline that in red pencil, not a single case, even though the communal door downstairs was unlocked, of even a single pair of galoshes going missing from our entrance. And note, there are 12 apartments, and I receive patients here. One fine day in March 1917, all the galoshes disappeared, including 2 pairs of mine, as well as 3 sticks, a coat, and the doorman's samovar. And since then, the galosh stand has effectively ceased to exist. My dear fellow, I'm not talking about the steam heating now. Never mind that. I accept that. If there is a social revolution, who needs heating? But I am asking, why? When all this business began, did everyone start walking up the marble staircase in dirty galoshes and felt boots? Why, to this very day, do galoshes have to be kept under lock and key, and a soldier assigned to stand guard so that nobody can make off with them? Why do they take away the carpet from the main staircase? Where did Karl Marx write that entrance number 2 of Kolobukov house on Prochestenka Street should be boarded up so that people have to go round to the back entrance? Where's the need for that? Why can't the proletariat leave its galoshes downstairs? Why does it trail mud across the marble? But Philip Filipovich, it doesn't have any galoshes to its name, the bitten one tried to object. Nothing of the kind! Philip Filipovich replied in a voice of thunder and poured himself a glass of wine. I don't approve of liqueurs after dinner. They make you feel heavy and have a bad effect on the liver. Nothing of the kind. It's wearing galoshes now, and those galoshes are mine. The very self-same galoshes that disappeared in spring 1917. Question is, who purloined them? Me? It couldn't have been. The bourgeois Sablin? Philip Filipovich jabbed his finger up towards the ceiling. The very suggestion is ridiculous. The sugar factory owner Polozov? Philip Filipovich pointed off to one side. Out of the question. It was those songbirds of ours who did it. Yes, indeed, sir. But they could at least take them off on the staircase. Philip Filipovich began turning crimson. Why in damnation did they remove the plants from the landings? Why is the electric light, which had failed, if my memory does not deceive me, only twice in the last 20 years, cut off regularly once a month these days? Dr. Baumenthal, statistics are a terrible thing. You're familiar with my latest work, and so you know that better than anyone else. Economic collapse, Philip Filipovich. No! Philip Filipovich retorted with perfect assurance. No! You should be the first, Ivan Arnoldovich, to refrain from using that very phrase. It's a mirage, mist, a fiction. Philip Filipovich spread his short fingers wide, sending two shadows that looked like tortoises scurrying across the tablecloth. What is this economic collapse of yours? An old woman with a crutch? A witch who has smashed the windows and put out all the lamps? Why, she simply doesn't exist! What exactly do you mean by this phrase? Philip Filipovich asked furiously, addressing the unfortunate wooden duck hanging upside down by the sideboard, and then answered for it. I'll tell you what. If, instead of operating every evening, I start holding choral sing-songs in my flat, I shall fall victim to economic collapse. If when I go to the toilet I start, begging your pardon, missing the WC when I urinate, and Zina and Darya Petrovna do the same, economic collapse will invade the lavatory. Therefore, the economic collapse is not in the water closets, it's inside people's heads. And so when these baritones cry, "Beat the economic collapse," I laugh. Philip Filipovich's face contorted into a grimace that made the bitten one's jaw drop. I swear to you, it makes me laugh. It means that every one of them should be thumping the back of his own head, and when he beats all the hallucinations out of himself and sets about cleaning out sheds, the job he ought to be doing, the economic collapse, will cure itself and disappear. You cannot serve two gods! You cannot sweep the tram lines and organize the lives of some Spanish ragamuffins at the same time. Nobody can do that, Doctor, and especially not people who are about 200 years behind the Europeans in their development and still aren't quite sure how to button up their own trousers. Philip Filipovich got carried away. The nostrils of his hawk nose flared. His strength renewed by the ample dinner, he thundered like some ancient prophet, and his hair glittered like silver. His words showered down on the drowsy dog like some dull underground rumbling. Now and again the vision of its dream threw up the owl with the stupid yellow eyes, or the repulsive face of the cook in the dirty white cap, or Philip Filipovich's dashing moustache lit up by the harsh electric light from under the lampshade. Or a sleepy sleigh creaked by and disappeared, and meanwhile in the dog's stomach the tattered piece of roast beef was digesting, afloat in gastric juices. He could earn money at public meetings, the dog dreamed dimly. A first-class hustler. But then, obviously, he's got money to burn anyway. "A policeman!" shouted Philip Filipovich. "A policeman!" There were strange bubbles bursting in the dog's brain. "A policeman! That's the only thing that will do it. And it makes no difference at all whether he's wearing a tin badge or a red cap. Stand a policeman beside every one of them and make that policeman restrain the vocal outburst of our citizens. You say it is economic collapse. Let me tell you, Doctor, that nothing will change for the better in our building or in any other building until you suppress these singers. Only then will they stop these concerts of theirs, and then the situation will improve of its own accord." "This is counter-revolutionary talk, Philip Filipovich," the bitten one remarked jocularly. "God forbid that anyone should hear you." "There's nothing dangerous about it," Philip Filipovich objected heatedly. "No counter-revolution at all. And by the way, that's another word I simply can't bear. Nobody has the slightest idea what lies concealed behind it. The devil only knows, but as I said, there is none of that counter-revolution in what I said. It's just common sense and experience of real life." At this point, Philip Filipovich pulled the tail of the gleaming, creased napkin out from under his collar, crumpled it up, and set it down beside his unfinished glass of wine. The bitten one immediately got to his feet and thanked him. "Merci." "Just a moment, Doctor," said Philip Filipovich, detaining him. He took a wallet out of his trouser pocket, screwed up his eyes, counted off the white notes, and held them out to the bitten one with the words, "Today, Ivan Arnoldovich, you are due 40 roubles. Here you are." The dog's victim thanked him politely, blushing, and put the money into the pocket of his jacket. Do you need me this evening, Philip Filipovich?" he inquired. "No, thank you very much, my dear fellow. You are not going to do anything today. In the first place, the rabbit died, and in the second place, Aida is on at the Bolshoi Theatre today, and I haven't heard it for a long time. I love that, you remember it? The duet. Tari-ra-rim." "Where do you find the time, Philip Filipovich?" the doctor asked respectfully. "A man who never hurries can always find time for everything," his host explained didactically. "Of course, if I started hopping from one meeting to another and singing songs all day long like a nightingale instead of attending to my real work, I wouldn't have time to get anything done." In Philip Filipovich's pocket, his fingers set the repeater watch chiming in heavenly fashion. "Just after 8. I'll go for the second act. I'm all in favor of the division of labor. They can sing at the Bolshoi, and I'll operate. That will be fair. And no economic collapse. Now remember, Ivan Arnoldovich, keep a close eye on the things notwithstanding. Just as soon as there is a suitable death, straight into the nutrient fluid and bring it to me." "Don't worry, Philip Filipovich, the autopsy pathologists have promised me." "Excellent. And in the meantime, we'll observe this street neurasthenic. Give him a wash. Give his side a chance to heal." "He's concerned for me," thought the dog. "A very good man. I know who he is. He's a magician, a wizard, a sorcerer out of a dog's fairy tale. After all, I can't just be dreaming all of this. But what if it is a dream?" The dog shivered in his sleep. "What if I wake up and it's all gone? No silk-covered lamp, no warmth, no full belly? Oh, and it starts all over again. The gateway, the terrible cold, the icy asphalt, the hunger, the vicious people, the canteen, the snow. God, I'd really suffer then." Chapter 4. But none of that happened. It was the gateway that melted away like a bad dream and never returned. Apparently, the economic collapse was not really all that terrible. Even despite it, the pleated accordions under the windows were filled with steam twice a day, sending waves of warmth rolling through the entire apartment. It was absolutely clear. The dog had drawn the grand prize canine lottery ticket. At least twice every day now, his eyes were filled with tears of gratitude to the sage of Prechestinka Street. And besides that, all the cheval glass mirrors in the drawing-room and between the cupboards in the reception-room reflected a fortunate and handsome dog. "I'm handsome. Perhaps I'm some unknown dog prince incognito," the dog thought as he stared at the shaggy coffee-coloured dog with a satisfied look on his face, strolling through the vistas of mirror glass. "It's perfectly possible that my grandmother had a fling with a Newfoundland. When I look now, I can see a white patch on my face. Where's that from, I wonder? Philip Filipovich is a man of great taste. He wouldn't pick up just any old mongrel dog off the street." In the course of a week, the dog ate as much as it had during the previous 1.5 hungry months on the street. But that was only by weight, of course. As for the quality of food at Philip Filipovich's home, that went without saying. Even if we disregard the fact that every day Darya Petrovna bought a heap of offcuts at the Smolensky market for 18 kopecks, it is enough merely to mention the dinners in the dining-room at 7 o'clock, at which the dog was present despite the elegant Zina's protests. It was during these dinners that the title of deity was finally confirmed on Philip Filipovich. The dog stood on its hind legs and chewed his jacket. The dog learned to recognize the way that Philip Filipovich rang the doorbell, to abrupt, resounding peals from the master of the house, and ran barking to meet him in the hallway. His master burst in his silver fox fur, glittering with a million snowy spangles, smelling of mandarins, cigars, perfume, lemons, petrol, eau de cologne, and thick woolen cloth, and his voice boomed through the entire apartment like a megaphone. "Why did you rip the owl to pieces, you swine? Was he bothering you? I said, was he bothering you? Why did you break Professor Mechnikov?" "At least once you should give him a good whipping, Philip Filipovich," Zina said, outraged. "Or he'll get completely spoiled. Just look at what he's done to your galoshes." "Nobody should ever be whipped," Philip Filipovich said, annoyed by the comment. Remember that once and for all. The only way to influence a human being or an animal is by persuasion. Have you given him any meat today?
Good grief, he's eaten us out of house and home. Do you have to ask, Philip Philippovich? I'm amazed he doesn't burst.
Well, let him eat and enjoy it. What did the owl do to upset you, you hooligan?
The dog wheedled and whined, creeping around on his belly with his paws twisted out. Then he was dragged with a rumpus by the scruff of his neck through the reception room and into the study. The dog howled and snarled, scrabbling at the carpet and sliding along on his backside as if he were in a circus. The glass-eyed owl was lying on the carpet in the middle of the study with its belly ripped open, and some kind of red rag smelling of naphthalene trailing out of it. The portrait bust was lying on the desk, smashed to smithereens.
I deliberately didn't clear it up so that you could admire it for yourself, Zina declared in a sad voice. He actually jumped up on the desk, the scoundrel, and then grabbed it, snap, by the tail. Before I could even gather my wits, he'd ripped it to pieces. Rub his face in the owl, Philip Philippovich, to teach him not to go breaking things.
And the howling began. They dragged the dog, who was glued to the carpet, over to the owl to rub his face in it, and the dog's eyes filled with bitter tears as he thought, "Beat me, but only don't throw me out of the apartment." "Send the owl straight off to the taxidermist today. And there's 8 roubles, and 16 kopecks for the tram. Go to Muir's and buy him a good collar and a chain." The next day they put a broad, shiny collar round the dog's neck. Just for a moment after he glanced in the mirror, he felt very upset, put his tail between his legs and went off to the bathroom, thinking he might be able to scrape it off against a trunk or a box. But very soon the dog realized that he was simply a fool. Zina took him out on the chain for a walk down Oberhof Lane. The dog walked along like a prisoner, burning with shame. But once they'd walked along Prechestenka Street as far as Christ Cathedral, he realized the true significance of a collar in life. A furious envy glowed in the eyes of all the dogs they met, and at Myrtle Lane some gangling beast with a docked tail barked at him, "Master's lackey," and "Creep." As they were crossing the tram lines, the militiaman gave the collar a glance of delighted respect, and when they came back home, the most unheard-of thing possible happened. Fyodor, the doorman himself, opened the door with his own hand to let Sharik in, remarking to Zina as he did so, "That's a fine fluffy dog Philip Philippovich has got himself, and incredibly fat." "I should think so. He eats for 6, explained Zina, rosy-cheeked and beautiful from the frost. "A collar's just like a briefcase," the dog quipped to himself and waggled his backside as he walked up to the piano nobile like a genuine aristocrat. Having come to appreciate the collar at its true worth, the dog made his first visit to that most important compartment of paradise, to which he had previously been categorically forbidden entry, the kingdom of the cook, Darya Petrovna herself. The entire apartment was not worth 2 inches of Darya's realm. Every day the flames crackled and roared in the kitchen range with the black front and the tiled top. Against those crimson pillars Darya Petrovna's face burnt in eternal fiery torment, an unsated passion, gleaming and running with fat. 22 artificial diamonds glittered in her fashionable hairstyle, cut long over the ears with 2 braids of light hair woven into a basket at the back. Golden pans hung on hooks around the walls. The entire kitchen was an uproar of smells and bubbling and hissing in closed vessels. "Out!" Darya Petrovna howled. "Get out, you homeless pickpocket! You're the last thing I need in here. I'll take the poker to you!" "What's all this about? What are you barking like that for?" thought the dog, narrowing his eyes benignly. "What kind of pickpocket am I? Can't you see my collar?" And he tried creeping in sideways through the door and sticking his face through first. The dog Sharik had some secret for winning people's hearts. 2 days later, he was already lying beside the basket of coal and watching Darya Petrovna work. She was cutting the heads and legs of helpless hazel grouse with a sharp, narrow knife and then ripping the soft flesh off the bones like some crazed murderer, tearing the entrails out of chickens, twirling something in the mincer. Meanwhile, Sharik worried away at a hazel grouse's head.
Darya Petrovna took pieces of well-soaked white bread out of a bowl of milk and mixed them with a meat pulp on a board, poured cream over all of it, sprinkled it with salt, and moulded it into rissoles. The roaring in the stove was like a conflagration. Something squeaked, bubbled, and jumped about on the frying pan. The oven door flew back with a crash to reveal a fearsome inferno of seething, shimmering flame. In the evening, the stone Moor's fury abated, and above the white half-curtain the kitchen window was filled with the dense, solemn Prechestinka night with its solitary star. In the kitchen the floor was damp, the pans glowed in worn mystery, a fireman's peaked cap lay on the table. Sharik lay on the warm stove like a lion guarding a gate, lifting one ear in curiosity as he watched an excited man with a black moustache and a wide leather belt embrace Darya Petrovna in the room that belonged to her and Zina. Apart from its ghastly pale, powdered nose, Darya Petrovna's entire face blazed with tormented passion. A chink of light lay across a portrait of the man with the black moustache, with an Easter rose hanging from it.
"Attacked me like a real devil," Darya Petrovna muttered in semi-darkness. "Get off! Zina will be here in a moment. What is this? Have they rejuvenated you as well?" "We don't need any of that," the man with the black moustache replied hoarsely, struggling to control himself. "You're a real fiery one."
In the evenings the Prechestinka star was hidden behind heavy curtains, and if Aida was not on at the Bolshoi Theatre and the All-Russian Surgical Society was not in session, the deity would be located in the deep armchair in the study. None of the ceiling lights were lit. The only lamp burning was the green one on the desk. Sharik lay in the shadow on the carpet and gazed in fascination at the appalling goings-on. There were human brains lying in repulsive, cloudy, acrid fluid in glass jars. With his arms bare to the elbows and reddish rubber gloves on his hands, the deity fumbled in the convolutions with slippery, unfeeling fingers. Sometimes the deity would arm himself with a little gleaming knife and gently cut into the yellow, spongy brains. "To the sacred banks of the Nile," the deity sang quietly to himself, biting on his lips and remembering the golden interior of the Bolshoi Theatre. At that time of the day, pipes were heated to their hottest. The heat from them rose up to the ceiling, from where it spread right round the whole room. The final flea in the dog's coat, not yet combed out by Philip Filipovich, but already doomed, became active. The carpets muffled sounds in the apartment, and then, far away, the front door jangled. "Zinka's gone to the cinema," the dog thought. "And when she comes back, I expect we'll have supper. It ought to be veal cutlets today." And then, in the morning of that terrible day, Sharik was pricked by a premonition that left him feeling suddenly jaded, and he ate his breakfast, half a cup of oat porridge and yesterday's mutton bone, without any appetite at all. He walked through drearily into the reception room and howled quietly at his own reflection there. But that afternoon, after Zina had taken him for a walk to the boulevard, the day continued as usual. There were no patients that day because, as everybody knew, patients were not received on Tuesdays, and the deity was sitting in the study with some heavy books with bright-coloured pictures open on his desk. They were waiting for dinner. The dog's spirits were revived slightly by the thought that today's main course, as he had discovered for certain in the kitchen, was to be turkey. As he walked along the corridor, the dog heard the telephone in Philip Filipovich's study give a harsh, abrupt ring. Philip Filipovich picked up the receiver, listened, and suddenly became excited. "Excellent," the dog heard his voice say. "Bring it here immediately." He began bustling about and rang the bell, and when Zina came in, he ordered her to serve dinner immediately. "Dinner! Dinner! Dinner!" In the dining room, they began clattering the plates about straight away. As Zina sprang into action, Darya Petrovna could be heard muttering in the kitchen that the turkey was ready. The dog began feeling nervous again. "I don't like commotion in the apartment," he thought. And no sooner did he think it, than the commotion assumed an even more unpleasant character, primarily due to the appearance of his sometime victim, Dr. Bomenthal. He brought a nasty-smelling suitcase with him and went dashing through into the examination room with it without even taking his coat off. Philip Filipovich abandoned his unfinished cup of coffee, which was something he never did, and ran out to meet Bomental, which was another thing that he never did. "When did he die?" he shouted. 3 hours ago," Bomental replied, leaving his snow-covered fur hat on as he unfastened the suitcase. "Who is it that's died?" the dog thought in gloomy resentment, and poked his head in under their feet. "I can't stand it when people start running around like lunatics." "Get out! Out of my way! Quick, quick, quick!" Philip Filipovich shouted in all directions and started ringing all the bells, or so it seemed to the dog. A Zina came running. "Zina! Bring Darya Petrovna to the phone, to take people's names, don't let anyone in. I need you. Dr. Bomental, I implore you, be quick, quick!" "I don't like this. I don't like it." The dog sulked gloomily and began wandering aimlessly around the flat, while all the fuss and bother was concentrated in the examination room. Zina was suddenly wearing a white coat that looked like a shroud, and she began running from the examination room to the kitchen and back. Maybe I should go and have a feed? To hell with the lot of them, the dog thought, and suddenly received a surprise. "Don't give Sharik anything!" came the thunderous command from the examination room. "Oh yes, he's so easy to keep an eye on." "Lock him up!" And they lured Sharik into the bathroom and locked him in there. What an insult, thought Sharik, sitting in the dimly lit bathroom. This is just plain stupid. And the dog spent about a quarter of an hour in the bathroom in a strange sort of mood, something between fury and deep depression. Everything seemed so dreary and hazy and uncertain. "All right, just see what I do to your galoshes again tomorrow, my dear Philip Filipovich," he thought. "You've already had to buy 2 pairs, now you'll have to buy another one, to teach you not to go locking dogs up." But then his vehement line of thought was interrupted. For some reason he suddenly recalled with perfect clarity a brief episode in his very early youth. The bright, sunny, boundless courtyard at the Preobrazhensky gates, shards of sunshine glinting in bottles, broken bricks, the homeless dogs their own masters. "No, you could never. You'll never leave this place for any kind of freedom. No point in lying about it," the dog thought drearily, sniffling as he breathed. "You've got used to it. I'm my noble master's dog, a creature of culture. I've tasted a better life. And what is freedom anyway? Nothing but smoke, a mirage, a fiction. The pipe dream of those doomed Democrats." Then the semi-darkness of the bathroom began to seem frightening. He started howling and hurling himself at the door. He started scratching. The sound echoed round the apartment as if it were a barrel. "I'll tear the owl to pieces again," the dog thought in helpless spite. Then he felt weak and lay down for a while, and when he got up, the hair of his coat suddenly stood up on end when he thought he saw a pair of loathsome wolf's eyes glowing in the bath. Then, at the very height of his torment, the door opened. The dog went out, shook himself, and set out sullenly for the kitchen. But Zina insistently led him by his collar towards the examination room. The dog felt a cold tremor run through him. "What do they need me for?" he thought suspiciously. "My side's healed up. I don't understand any of this." His stubborn paws started skidding across the slippery parquet, and that was how he was dragged into the examination room. The first thing that struck him was the unaccustomed brilliance of the lighting. The white globe on the ceiling was glowing so brightly that it hurt his eyes. A priest standing in the white radiance chanted under his breath of the sacred banks of the Nile. It was only from the vague scent that the dog could tell it was Philip Filipovich. His close-cropped grey hair was hidden under a white cap that looked like a patriarch's pointed cowl. The priest was dressed all in white, and over the white, like a priest's stole, he had a narrow rubber apron. He had black gloves on his hands. The bitten one was also wearing a pointed cowl. The long table was unfolded, and another small, quadrangular one on a gleaming support had been moved up beside it. Today the dog suddenly hated the bitten one more than ever, and most of all for the way his eyes looked. Usually bold and direct, today they shifted about to avoid the dog's gaze. They were watchful and insincere, and there was some disagreeable murky business, if not an actual crime, lurking somewhere in their depths. The dog gave him a look of sullen anguish and moved away into the corner. "The collar, Zina," Philip Philippovich said quietly. "Only don't excite him." Zina's eyes immediately became as loathsome as the bitten one's. She went over to the dog and stroked him in a manner that was clearly counterfeit. The dog gave her a look of anguished disdain. "What can I do? There are 3 of you. Take me if you want, only you ought to be ashamed. If only I'd known what you were going to do with me." As Zina unfastened the collar, the dog shook his head and snorted. The bitten one appeared in front of him, giving off a repulsive, numbing smell. "Phew! What filth! Why do I feel so sick and dizzy and afraid?" the dog thought, and backed away from the bitten one. "Quickly, doctor!" Philip Philippovich said impatiently. The air was filled with an acrid, sweetish odour. Without taking his vile, watchful eyes off the dog, the bitten one pulled his right hand from behind his back and thrust a ball of damp cotton wool against the animal's nose. Sharek was dumbfounded. He felt his head beginning to spin slightly, but he just managed to shrink away. The bitten one bounded after him and suddenly smothered his entire face in cotton wool. The dog's breathing was immediately blocked, but he still managed to break free once again. "The villain!" he thought briefly. "What did I do?" And then he was smothered again. Suddenly, at this point, he saw a lake appear in the middle of the examination room, with supremely happy, otherworldly dogs, all unbelievably pink, sailing around on it in boats. The bones disappeared from his legs, and they buckled under him. "On to the table!" The jovial words spoken in Philip Philippovich's voice came thudding down and scattered into rivulets of orange. The horror disappeared and was replaced by joy. For about 2 seconds the fading dog loved the bitten one. The entire world turned downside up, and there was the cold but pleasant sensation of a hand under his belly. And then, nothing. The dog Sharek lay stretched out on the narrow operating table, with his head hammering helplessly against the white oilcloth pillow. His belly had been shaved clean, and now Dr. Baumenthal, breathing heavily in his haste, was cropping Sharek's head, his mechanical clippers biting into the fur. Philip Philippovich, leaning heavily on his palms against the edge of the table, followed the procedure with his eyes glittering like the gold rims of his spectacles, and said anxiously, "Ivan Arnoldovich, the most important moment is when I go into the Turkish saddle. Instantly, I implore you, hand me the appendage and suture immediately. If it starts bleeding in there, we'll lose time, and we'll lose the dog. But then, he hasn't got a chance in any case." He paused, screwing up an eye, glanced in an odd, quizzical way into the dog's half-closed, sleeping eye, and added, "And you know, I feel sorry for him. Just imagine, I've got used to him." He raised his hands as he said this, as if he were blessing the ill-fated dog Sharek for some arduous feat. He was trying to prevent even a single speck of dust settling on the black rubber. The dog's skin gleamed white through his cropped fur. Baumenthal threw aside his clippers and set to work with a razor. He lathered up the helpless little head and began shaving it. The blade made a loud, crunching sound, and here and there blood welled up. After shaving the head, the bitten one wiped it down with a wad of cotton wool moistened with benzene. Then he stretched out the dog's naked stomach and said, panting heavily, "Ready." Zina turned on the tap above the sink, and Baumenthal rushed over to wash his hands. Zina poured alcohol over them from a bottle. "May I go now, Philip Philippovich?" she asked, casting a squeamish sideways glance at the dog's shaved head. "You may." Zina disappeared. Baumenthal carried on bustling about. He set light napkins of gauze all around Sharik's head, so that what remained on the pillow was a bald dog's cranium that no one had seen before, and a strange, bearded face. At this point, the priest stirred into action. He straightened up, glanced at the dog's head, and said, "Bless this work, Lord. The knife." Baumenthal extracted a small knife with a plump, round blade from the gleaming heap on the little table and handed it to the priest. Then he also donned black gloves just like the priest. "Is he sleeping?" asked Philip Filipovich. "Yes, soundly." Philip Filipovich's teeth clenched together. A sharp, piercing gleam lit up his eyes, and with a flourish of the knife, he drew a long, precise incision down Sharik's belly. The skin parted instantly, and blood spurted out in all directions. Baumenthal dashed over eagerly and started applying pressure to Sharik's wound with lumps of gauze. Then he pressed its sides together with little tweezers like sugar tongs, and it dried up. Beads of sweat stood out on Baumenthal's forehead. Philip Filipovich slashed again, and the two of them began tearing Sharik's body apart with hooks, scissors, and some kind of clamps. Out slipped the pink and yellow tissues, weeping bloody dew. Philip Filipovich twisted the knife in the body and then cried, "Scissors!" The instrument flickered through the bitten one's hands as if he were a conjurer. Philip Filipovich went in deep, and with a few twists he tore the seminal vesicles out of Sharik's body, together with some other fragments. Baumenthal, soaking wet from all the stress and strain, dashed over to a glass jar and extracted some other wet, flabby seminal vesicles from it. Short, moist strings began dancing and curling in the hands of the professor and his assistant. The crooked needles began clicking in the clamps, and they sewed the seminal vesicles in where Sharik's had been. The priest leaned back from the wound, thrust a lump of gauze against it, and ordered, "Suture the skin immediately, doctor." Then he glanced across at the round white clock on the wall. "We took 14 minutes. Baumenthal hissed through clenched teeth, and thrust his crooked needle into the flaccid skin. Then they both became as nervous as murderers in a hurry. "Knife!" cried Philip Filipovich. The knife seemed to leap into his hand of its own accord, and then Philip Filipovich's face became terrible. He bared his porcelain and gold crowns in a scowl, and in a single flourish traced a red coronet around Sharik's forehead. They pulled back the skin with the shaved hair like a scalp, and exposed the bone of the skull. Philip Filipovich cried, "Trepan!" Baumenthal handed him a gleaming handbrace. Biting his lips, Philip Filipovich began jabbing the brace in and drilling little holes in Sharik's cranium about a centimetre apart to form a circle round the entire skull. He spent no more than 5 seconds on each one. Then he took a most curiously fashioned saw, stuck its tail into the first hole, and began sawing, in the same way that they cut fretwork designs for ladies' needlework boxes. The skull squeaked quietly and trembled. About 3 minutes later, they removed the top of Sharik's skull. Then the cupola of Sharik's brain was exposed, grey with bluish streaks and reddish blotches. Philip Filipovich worked his way into the membrane with a pair of scissors and opened them up. Just once a thin fountain of blood spurted out, narrowly missing the professor's eye and sprinkling his cap. Clutching a pair of torsion forceps, Baumenthal dashed in like a tiger and clamped it. The sweat was streaming off Baumenthal, and his face had turned fleshy and blotchy. His eyes flickered back and forth between the professor's hands and a plate on the table. Philip Filipovich himself had become positively terrifying. Hoarse, wheezing sounds erupted from his nose. His teeth were bared to the gums. He tore the pia mater off the brain and went in deep somewhere, easing the hemispheres up out of their open chalice. At that point, Baumenthal started to turn pale, grabbed Sharik's chest with one hand and said in a husky voice, "The pulse is falling sharply." Philip Filipovich glanced around him savagely, mumbled something, and cut in even deeper. Baumenthal broke open a glass ampule with a crunch, drew something out of it into a syringe, and insidiously injected Sharik somewhere near the heart. "I'm approaching the Turkish saddle," Philip Filipovich growled and lifted Sharik's greyish-yellow brain out of the head with his bloody, slippery gloves. He squinted at Sharik's face for a moment, and Baumenthal immediately broke open a second ampule of yellow liquid and drew it out into a long syringe. "Into the heart?" he asked timidly.
"Why are you still asking?" the professor roared furiously. "You've let him die 5 times already! Inject it! Would you believe it?"
And as he spoke, his face was like the face of an inspired bandit. The doctor swung his hand and deftly thrust the needle into the dog's heart. "He's alive, but just barely," he whispered timidly.
"No time now to discuss whether he's alive or not," rasped the terrifying Philip Filipovich. "I'm in the saddle. He's going to die anyway. What the... To the sacred banks of the Nile. Give me the appendage."
Baumenthal handed him a glass jar in which a little white lump was dangling in fluid on a thread. With one hand... "There is no one to match him in Europe, I swear to God," Baumenthal thought dimly. He plucked up the dangling lump, and with the other cut out one just like it, somewhere deep below the spread hemispheres. He tossed Sharik's little lump onto the plate, inserted the new one in the brain together with its thread, and his short fingers seemed miraculously to have become slim and flexible as he twisted the amber-yellow thread round it to secure it. After that, he threw some kind of stretching frame out of the head and a pair of forceps, then set the brain back into its bony chalice and asked, more calmly now,
"He's dead, of course."
"A thready pulse," Baumenthal replied.
"More adrenaline."
The professor flung the pyometer back over the brain, set the sawn-off top of the skull precisely in place, drew the scalp across, and roared,
"Suture!"
Baumenthal sewed up the head in 5 minutes, breaking 3 needles. And now there was Sharik's lifeless, inert face set against a blood-stained background, with a circular wound ringing his head. Philip Filipovich promptly withdrew completely, like a sated vampire, tore off one glove, scattering a fine haze of sweat from inside it, ripped the other apart and threw it on the floor, and pressed a bell button on the wall. Zina appeared in the doorway with her face turned away in order not to see Sharik covered in blood. The priest removed his blooded cowl with chalk-white hands and cried, "A papyrosa for me immediately, Zina. A full set of fresh underwear, and a bath." He rested his chin on the edge of the table, raised the dog's right eyelid with 2 fingers, glanced into the eye that was clearly dying, and said, "Well, I'll be damned. He's not dead yet. He's going to die anyway. Dr. Baumenthal, I feel sorry for the dog. He was affectionate, but cunning." Chapter 5. Dr. Ivan Arnoldovich Baumenthal's journal. A slim notebook in writing paper format. Covered in Baumenthal's handwriting. On the first 2 pages it is close, neat and clear. Thereafter it is erratic and agitated, with a large number of blots. 22nd December 1924. Monday. Case history. Test animal, a dog approximately 2 years of age. Male. Breed, mongrel. Name, Sharik. Coat thin, clumpy, reddish-brownish with darker patches. Tail, the color of baked milk. On right side, the traces of a completely healed burn. Diet, prior to acquisition by the professor, poor. After 1 week here, extremely well fed. Weight, 8 kilograms! Exclamation mark. Heart, lungs, stomach, temperature, healthy. 23rd December. At 8:30 in the evening, the first operation in Europe using Professor Preobrazhensky's method was performed. Under chloroform anesthetic, Sharik's testicles were removed and human testicles with their appendages and spermatic cords were implanted in their place. They were taken from a 28-year-old man who died 4 hours and 4 minutes before the operation, and preserved in sterilized physiological fluid according to Professor Preobrazhensky's method. Immediately after this, performing trepanning at the top of the skull and appendage of the brain, the pituitary gland was removed and replaced by a human pituitary gland from the above-mentioned man, 8 centiliters of chloroform were injected, 1 syringe of camphor, 2 syringes of adrenaline into the heart. Basis for the operation: the performance of an experiment by Professor Preobrazhensky on the combined transplantation of the pituitary gland and testicles in order to clarify the question of the pituitary gland's acclimation rate and its subsequent effect on the rejuvenation of the organism. Operation carried out by Professor Philip Filipovich Preobrazhensky, assisted by Dr. Ivan Arnoldovich Pomental. During the night following the operation, pulse rate repeatedly dropped to dangerous levels. A fatal outcome anticipated. Immense doses of camphor according to the Preobrazhensky method. 24th December. In the morning, an improvement. Breathing twice normal rate, temperature 42 degrees. Camphor and caffeine subcutaneously. 25th December. Further deterioration. Pulse barely detectable, cooling of the extremities, no pupil response. Adrenaline into the heart, camphor according to the Preobrazhensky method, physiological fluid intravenously. 26th December. Some improvement. Pulse 180, breathing 92, temperature 41 degrees. Camphor, feeding by enema. 27th December. Pulse 152, breathing 50, temperature 39.8 degrees, pupils responding. Camphor subcutaneously. 28th December. Significant improvement. At midday, sudden copious sweating, temperature 37 degrees. Condition of surgical wounds unchanged, dressings renewed. First signs of appetite. Liquid nourishment. 29th December. Sudden onset of molting of fur on forehead and sides of the body. Summoned for consultation, Professor of the Department of Skin Diseases, Vasily Vasilyevich Bundaryov, and the Director of the Moscow Model Veterinary Institute. Their conclusion was that no similar case has been described in the literature. No definitive diagnosis made. Temperature normal. Note in pencil. Barked for the first time this evening, 8:15. The timbre of the voice has changed quite sharply and distinctly, and the tone is lower. Instead of the sound bow-bow, the bark consists of the syllables ah-ooh, and its tone is vaguely reminiscent of a groan. 30th December. The shedding of the fur has developed into general alopecia. Weighing produced an unexpected result. Weight was 30 kilogram due to growth, lengthening of the bones. The dog remains in a lying position as before. 31st December. A colossal appetite. A blot in the notebook, following the blot in hasty handwriting. At 12:12 in the afternoon, the dog distinctly barked, sh-i-f. There is a break in the notebook, and then the following, evidently written in error due to agitation. 1st December, crossed out and corrected. 1st January, 1925. Photographed this morning, quite distinctly barks "shif," repeating this word loudly and apparently enjoying it greatly. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, in capital letters, he laughed, causing the housemaid Zina to faint. In the evening he pronounced the word "shif-some," or "shif," 8 times in a row. Written in crooked letters in pencil. The professor has deciphered the word "shifsome." It means moss fish. This is quite incredible. 2nd January. Photographed while smiling using magnesium. Got up from the bed and stood confidently on his hind legs for half an hour. Almost my height. A page inserted in the notebook. Russian science has barely escaped a heavy loss. Case history of Professor Philip Filipovich Preobrazhensky. At 1:13, Professor Preobrazhensky fainted away completely and fell. In falling, he struck his head against the leg of a chair. Tincture of valerian. While Zina and I were present, the dog, if it can be called a dog, of course, abused Professor Preobrazhensky in obscene language. A break in notes. 6th of January. in places in pencil, in places in purple ink. Today, after his tail fell off, he pronounced the word tavern quite distinctly. The phonograph is working. Damned if I know what's going on. I am completely at a loss. The professor has stopped receiving patients. Since 5 o'clock, we have heard vulgar swearing coming from the examination room, where this creature is strutting about, and the words, "another couple." 7th January. He speaks a large number of words. Cabby? No seats left? Evening Gazette? The best present for children? And absolutely all the swear words that exist in the vocabulary of Russian. His appearance is strange. The only remaining fur is on his head, on his chin, and on his chest. Otherwise he's hairless, with flaccid skin. In the region of the sexual organs he is assuming the form of a man. The skull is significantly enlarged. The forehead is low and slanting. My God, I am going to go insane. Philip Filipovich is still feeling unwell. I am conducting most of the observations. Phonograph, photographs. Rumours have spread through the city. The consequences are incalculable. This afternoon the entire lane was full of various good-for-nothings and old women. The idlers are still standing under the windows now. The morning newspapers carried a quite incredible notice. The rumours of a Martian on Orbakov Lane are entirely unfounded. They were spread by traders from the Sukharovsky market and will be strictly punished. What damned Martian are they talking about? This is a total nightmare. Even better in the evening newspaper. They wrote that a child has been born who can play the violin, with a drawing of a violin and my photograph with the caption, "Professor Preobrazhensky, who carried out the caesarean section on the mother." This is absolutely unspeakable. He is pronouncing a new word. Militiaman. Apparently, Darya Petrovna was in love with me and pinched the photograph from Philip Filipovich's album. After I threw the reporters out, one of them crept into the kitchen and so on. Total chaos during reception hours. Today there were 82 calls. The telephone has been switched off. The childless women have gone mad, and they come. The full membership of the House Committee, led by Schwonder, but they themselves don't know why. 8th January. Late yesterday evening, a diagnosis was made. As a true scientist, Philip Filipovich acknowledges his mistake. Transplanting the pituitary gland does not result in rejuvenation, but in total humanization. Underlined 3 times. His astonishing and astounding discovery is nonetheless significant for that. He walked around the flat for the first time today. He laughed in the corridor when he looked at the electric lamp. Then, accompanied by Philip Filipovich and myself, he went through into the study. He stands firmly on his hind, word crossed out, on his legs, and gives the impression of a small man with a poorly developed physique. He laughed in the study. His smile is unpleasant and somehow artificial. After that he scratched the back of his head, looked around, and I noted down a new, distinctly pronounced word. Bourgeois. He swore. His obscenity is methodical, continuous, and apparently entirely devoid of meaning. It has a certain phonographic quality, as if this creature had heard the swear words somewhere before, and recorded them in its brain automatically and unconsciously, and now it is spewing them out in bundles. But damn it, I'm not a psychiatrist. For some reason, Philip Filipovich finds the swearing remarkably distressing. There are moments when he seems to abandon the cool, restrained observation of new phenomena and lose patience. For instance, at one point during the swearing he suddenly shouted out nervously, "Stop that!" This produced no effect whatsoever. Following the stroll in the study, it required our joint efforts to reinstall Sharik in the examination room. After that, Philip Filipovich and I consulted. I must confess that this was the first time I had ever seen this confident and strikingly intelligent man at a loss. Singing quietly to himself, as is his habit, he asked, "What are we going to do now?" And he answered himself word for word as follows. "Moscow so, Yes. From Seville to Granada, Moscow, so, my dear doctor. I didn't understand a thing. He explained. I request you, Ivan Arnoldovich, to buy him underwear, trousers, and a jacket. 9th January. His vocabulary has been expanding by a new word every 5 minutes, on average, and since this morning by phrases too. It is as if they were frozen in his mind, and now they're thawing and emerging. Once it has emerged, a word remains in use. Since yesterday evening, the phonograph has recorded "Stop shoving," "Scoundrel," "Get off the platform," "I'll show you," "America confesses," "Primus stove." 10th of January. The dressing has taken place. He allowed the undershirt to be put on him quite willingly, even laughing happily. He refused the long johns, expressing his protest in hoarse cries of, "Get in line, you sons of bitches, get in line." He was dressed. The socks are too large for him. Some schematic drawings in the notebook, all indications suggesting that they represent the transformation of a dog's leg into a human one. Elongation of the rear half of the skeleton of the foot, tarsus. Extension of the toes, claws. Repeated systematic training in the use of the toilet. The servants are completely dispirited. But the creature's intelligence should be noted. Things are definitely moving in the right direction. 11th January. Completely reconciled to the trousers. Pronounced the long, cheerful phrase, "Give me some fags, you're wearing striped bags." The fur in his head is fine and silky. It can be easily confused with hair. But he still has white patches on the crown of his head, today the final fluff molted from his ears. A colossal appetite. Greatly enjoys eating herrings. An event at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The first words pronounced by the creature not in abstraction from surrounding phenomena, but in response to them. At the precise moment when the professor told him, "Don't throw your leftovers on the floor," he replied unexpectedly, "Shove off, you scab." Philip Filipovich was astounded. Then he recovered his composure and said, "If you dare to swear at me or the doctor again, you'll catch it hot." I was photographing Sharik at that moment. I am certain that he understood what the professor said. His face turned dark and sullen. He glowered rather resentfully, but then he quietened down. Hurrah! He understands. 12th January. Putting his hands in the pockets of his trousers. We are teaching him not to swear. He whistled, "Oi, little apple." He can converse coherently. I cannot refrain from several hypotheses. Rejuvenation be damned for the time being. There is something else here immeasurably more important. Professor Preobrazhensky's remarkable experiment has revealed one of the mysteries of the human brain. The previously baffling function of the pituitary gland, an appendage to the brain, has been explained. It determines the human form. Its hormones may be called the most important in the body, the hormones of form. A new area of science is opening up. A homunculus has been created without any Faustian retort. The surgeon's scalpel has brought into being a new unit of humanity. Professor Preobrazhensky, you are a creator. Blot. But I have been deviated from my theme, and so he can converse coherently. According to my supposition, what is happening is as follows. The successfully grafted pituitary gland has opened the speech center in the dog's brain, and the words have come flooding out. As I see it, what we have here is a developed brain that has come to life, not a newly created one. Oh, glorious confirmation of evolutionary theory. Oh, most great chain of life from the dog to the chemist Mendeleev. Another hypothesis of mine. During his period as a dog, Sharik's brain accumulated a huge number of concepts. All of the words that he began using in the first instance are street words. He heard them and stored them away in his brain. Now, as I walk down the street, I watch the dogs I meet with secret horror. God only knows what they have stored away in their brains. Sharik was reading. Reading! 3 exclamation marks. I guessed it, from Mossfish. He was reading that backwards from the end. And I even know where the solution to this riddle lies, in the dog's optic chiasm. The things that are going on in Moscow are beyond all human comprehension. 7 Sukharevsky market traders are already in jail for spreading rumors about the end of the world that the Bolsheviks have brought down on us. Daria Petrovna told me, and even named the precise date. On 28th November 1925, St. Stephen's Day, the world will collide with the axis of the universe. Some swindlers are already giving public lectures. We've stirred up such a commotion with this pituitary gland of ours. I feel like running away from the apartment. I have moved in with Preobrazhensky at his own request, and I spent the night in the reception room with Sharik. The examination room has been converted into a reception room. Schwanda was right after all. The House Committee is gloating. There is not a single pane of glass in the cupboards because he has been jumping about. We barely managed to break him of the habit. Something strange is happening to Philip. When I told him about my hypotheses and my hope of developing Sharik into a spiritually advanced individual, he hemmed and asked, "Do you really think so?" His tone is ominous. Could I really be mistaken? The old man has thought of something. While I tinker with the case history, he pores over the history of the man from whom we took the pituitary gland. Page inserted in the notebook. Klim Grigorievich Chugunkin, 28 years old, unmarried, non-party member, sympathizer. Tried in court 3 times and acquitted. The first time due to lack of evidence, the second time his social origins saved him, the third, probation with 15 years conditional hard labor, theft and burglary. Profession, balalaika player in taverns. Short, poor physique, liver distended, alcohol. Cause of death, a stab wound to the heart in the stop signal bar at the Preobrazhensky gates. The old man spends all his time sitting poring over Klim Chugunsky's case history. I don't understand what the point is. He mumbled something about not having realized that he ought to examine Chugunkin's entire body in the autopsy room. What the point is, I just don't understand. What difference does it make whose pituitary gland it is? 17th January. I haven't made any notes for several days. I was ill with influenza. During this period, the subject has developed to his final form. A. Entirely human in terms of body structure. B. Weight about 3 poods. C. Short. D. A small head. E. Has begun to smoke. F. Eats human food. G. Dresses himself independently. H. Conducts conversation fluently. So, that's the pituitary gland for you. Blot. I am terminating the case history of the illness at this point. We are dealing with a new organism. It should be observed from the beginning. Enclosures. Shorthand records of speech, phonograph recordings, photographs. Signature. Assistant to Professor Philip Filipovich Preobrazhensky. Dr. Bomental. Chapter 6. It was a winter evening, late January, that time before dinner when patients were received. Hanging on the lintel of the door into the reception room was a sheet of white paper on which the following was written in Philip Filipovich's handwriting. I forbid the eating of sunflower seeds in the apartment. F. Preobrazhensky. And in blue pencil in big capital letters like pieces of cake in Bomental's writing. The playing of musical instruments is prohibited from 5 in the evening until 7 in the morning. Then, in Zina's handwriting, when Philip Filipovich gets back, tell him that I don't know where he went. Fyodor says he's with Schwanda. In Preobrazhensky's handwriting, do I have to wait 100 years for the glacier? In Daria Petrovna's writing, capitals, Zina went to the shop. She said she'll bring him. The atmosphere in the dining room was entirely evening-like, thanks to the lamp glowing under its silk shade. The light falling from the buffet was split into two halves. The two facets of the mirror had been fastened together with a crooked cross of tape. Philip Filipovich was leaning over the table, engrossed in the vast sheet of an open newspaper. Bolts of lightning contorted his face, and short, raggedly cooed words escaped from between his teeth. He was reading a brief article. There can be absolutely no doubt that he is his illegitimate, as they used to say in rotten bourgeois society, son. This is how our pseudo-scientific bourgeoisie amuses itself. Each of them knows how to occupy 7 rooms until the bright red ray of the gleaming sword of justice glints above his head. Schwander. 2 walls away, someone was insistently strumming a balalaika with rollicking dexterity, and in Philip Filipovich's head the sounds of an intricate variation of "Shines the Moon" mingled with the words of the article to form a repulsive, gooey sludge. When he finished reading, he spat over his shoulder and began mechanically singing through the clenched teeth. Shines the moon, shines the moon, shines the moon. Bah! That cursed tune's got inside my head. He rang the bell. Zena's face appeared between the flaps of the door curtains. Tell him it's 5 o'clock. He has to stop and send him here. Please. Philip Filipovich sat in the armchair at the table. The brown stub of a cigar protruded from between the fingers of his left hand. A short man of unattractive appearance stood by the curtain, leaning against the lintel with one leg crossed over the other. The hair growing on his head was coarse, like bushes growing in a field that has been grubbed up, and his face was covered with unshaven fluff. The forehead was quite strikingly low. The dense, bristly brush of hair began almost immediately above the black brushes of the wide-set eyebrows. His jacket, ripped under the left armpit, was dotted with straw. The striped trousers were torn into holes in the right knee and stained with purple paint on the left. Round his neck the man had a garish sky-blue necktie, with an artificial ruby pin. The colour of this necktie was so strident that every now and then, when he closed his weary eyes, Philip Filipovich could still see a flaming torch with a light blue crown on the ceiling or on the wall. When he opened his eyes, he was blinded once again by the dazzling beams of light emitted by a pair of lacquered shoes with white spats on the floor. As if he were wearing galoshes, Philip Filipovich thought with a disagreeable feeling, sighed, sniffed, and began fiddling with his extinct cigar. The man by the door kept glancing at the professor with murky eyes as he smoked a papirosa, sprinkling ash on his shirt front. The clock on the wall beside the wooden hazel grouse chimed 5 times. Something else inside it groaned as Philip Filipovich began the conversation. "Haven't I already asked you twice not to sleep on the planks behind the stove in the kitchen, especially during the day?" The man coughed huskily, as if he'd choked on a bone, and replied, "The air's better in the kitchen." His voice was unusual, rather flat, and at the same time hollow, as if he were speaking into a little barrel. Philip Filipovich shook his head and asked, "Where did that vile rubbish come from? I'm talking about the tie." The little man followed his finger with his eyes, squinting down lovingly past his protruding lip at the tie. "Why is it vile?" he asked. "It's a real posh tie. Darya Petrovna gave it to me." "Then Darya Petrovna has given you something almost as disgusting as those shoes. What sort of glittering garbage is that? Where are they from? What did I ask you to do? Buy decent shoes, and what are these? Well, surely Dr. Baumenthal didn't choose shoes like that." "I told him to get lacquered ones. I'm as good as anyone else, aren't I? Go down to Kuznetsky Most. Everyone's wearing lacquered ones." Philip Filipovich turned his head sharply and started speaking in a grave voice. "No more sleeping behind the stove. Understand? It's sheer impudence. You get in the way. There are women there." The man's face darkened and his lips protruded. "Some women? Big deal. Real ladies. Plain ordinary servants, and as pushy as any woman commissar. It's all that Zinka telling tales. Philip Filipovich gave him a strict glance. Don't you dare call Zina Zinka, understand? Silence. Do you understand, I asked you? Yes. Remove that filthy object from your neck. You... Just take a look at yourself in the mirror. What on earth do you look like? Some kind of fairground clown? Don't throw your butts on the floor, I've asked you 100 times, and I don't want to hear another single swear word in this apartment. Don't spit! There's the spittoon. Take care using the urinal. Stop these conversations of yours with Zina. She's complaining that you lie in wait for her in the dark. You watch out. Who said, how should I bloody know to one of my patients? Do you think you're in some low tavern here? Why are you always so hard on me, Dad? The man suddenly whined. Philip Filipovich flushed and his spectacles glinted. Where do you see any dad of yours here? What outrageous familiarity! I don't ever want to hear that word again. Address me respectfully by my name and patronymic. An insolent resentment blazed up in the little man's eyes. Why do you keep on... It's always, don't spit, don't smoke, don't go there. What's all this about, anyway? Might as well be in a tram. Why don't you let me have a life? As far as Dad is concerned, that's not fair. Did I ask you to operate on me? The man barked indignantly. A fine business. Snatched a poor animal, slashed its head open with a knife, and now they're getting all finicky and squeamish. Maybe I didn't give my permission for the operation. And neither... The man raised his eyes to the ceiling as if he were trying to remember some formula of words. And neither did my family and relatives. Maybe I have the right to sue you. Philip Filipovich's eyes became perfectly round and the cigar tumbled from his fingers. What a louse, was the thought that flashed through his mind. How's that? He asked, screwing up his eyes. You wish to inform me that you're dissatisfied with having been transformed into a human being? Perhaps you prefer to go running round the garbage heaps again? Freezing in the gateways? Well, if I had only known... Why do you always keep on reproaching me with that? The garbage heap, the garbage heap. I managed to get my daily crust of bread. And what if I died under your knife, huh? What do you have to say to that, comrade? Philip Filipovich! Philip Filipovich exclaimed irritably. I'm no comrade of yours. This is monstrous! A nightmare, he thought. Why, yes, of course not, the man said ironically and extended his leg triumphantly. We understand that. What sort of comrade could we possibly be to you? Far be it. We haven't studied at university. We haven't lived in apartments with 15 rooms with bathrooms. Only it's time to forget all that. Nowadays everybody has the right. Philip Filipovich turned pale as he listened to the man's reasoning. The man interrupted what he was saying and set off demonstratively towards the ashtray with the crumpled papyrus in his hand. He waddled as he walked. He carried on crushing his butt into the shell for a long time with an expression that clearly said, See? See? After he had stubbed out the papyrosa, he started walking away, and then suddenly gnashed his teeth loudly and stuck his nose under his arm. Catch your fleas with your fingers! With your fingers! Philip Filipovich cried furiously. But what I don't understand is where you get them from. Do you think I breed them specially or something? Said the man, offended. Fleas obviously like me. And at this point he fumbled into the lining of his sleeve and released a wisp of light reddish fluff into the air. Philip Filipovich turned his eyes up to the garlands on the ceiling and drummed on the table with his fingers. Having executed the flea, the man moved on and sat down on a chair. As he did so, he bent his wrists and dangled his hands along the lapels of his jacket. His eyes squinted down at the square pattern of the parquet flooring. He contemplated his shoes, and that gave him great pleasure. Philip Filipovich glanced in the direction of the harsh, glaring patches of light on the blunt toes, narrowed his eyes and said, "What was the other business you wanted to tell me about?"
"What sort of business is it?" "Very simple business. I need identity papers, Philip Filipovich."
Philip Filipovich shuddered gently.
"Damnation! Papers? Ah, yes, indeed. Perhaps there is some way we could manage without."
His voice sounded uncertain and depressed.
"Oh, for goodness sake," the man replied confidently. "How can I manage without any papers? Well, excuse me. You know yourself it's strictly forbidden for anyone to live without any papers. In the first place, there is the House Committee."
"What has the House Committee got to do with it?"
"What sort of question is that?" "They meet me, and they ask me when are you going to register, dear sir."
"Oh, good Lord!" Philip Filipovich exclaimed dolefully. "They meet you, they ask you. I can just imagine what you tell them. Didn't I forbid you to go trailing up and down the stairs?"
"What am I, a convict?"
the man asked in surprise, and the awareness of his own righteousness flared up even in his ruby.
"What kind of word is that? Trailing? The things you say are rather offensive. I walk the same way other people do."
As he said this, he scuffed his lacquered feet across the parquet. Philip Filipovich fell silent, and his eyes shifted off to one side. "I really do need to restrain myself," he thought. He walked over to the sideboard and drained a glass of vodka in a single gulp. "Excellent," he said, more calmly now. "After all, it's not a matter of words. Well then, what does your charming House Committee say?"
"What can it say? And you shouldn't go insulting it by calling it charming. It protects interests."
"Whose interests, if I may be permitted to inquire?"
"Well, you know whose. The working element."
Philip Filipovich rolled up his eyes. "And what makes you a working man?"
"Well, I'm obviously not a net man, am I?"
"All right, then. What does the committee require in the defense of your revolutionary interests?"
"You know what? Register me in the apartment. They say, when did you ever hear of anyone living in Moscow without being registered? That's for a start. And the most important thing is an army reserve card. I don't want to be a deserter. And then there is the union, the labor exchange."
"Perhaps you might tell me what I can use as a basis for your registration. This tablecloth? Or my own passport? The situation has to be properly considered after all. Don't forget that you, after all, you're so to speak, a being who appeared unexpectedly, an experimental creation."
Philip Filipovich's voice became less and less certain as he spoke. The man maintained a triumphant silence.
"Excellent. Then what, after all, is needed in order to register you and, in general, to arrange everything in accordance with your House Committee's plans? After all, you don't have a first name or a surname."
"That's not fair of you. I can quite easily choose a first name and patronymic for myself. Print it in the newspaper, and it's all done and dusted."
"By what name do you wish to be known?"
"Polygraph Polygrafovich."
"Don't start playing the bloody fool," Philip Filipovich responded morosely. "I'm being serious with you."
The man's thin little moustache twisted in an ironic smirk. "There's something I don't understand here," he said with pointed merriment. "I'm not allowed to swear. I'm not allowed to spit. But all I ever hear from you is, 'Bloody fool, bloody fool.' Obviously, it's only professors who are allowed to swear in the RSFSR.
Philip Filipovich flushed and broke a glass as he tried to fill it. He drank from another and thought, "A little bit longer and he'll be teaching me manners. And he'll be right. I can't keep myself in hand."
He swung around in his chair, bowed from the waist with exaggerated politeness, and said with iron firmness,
"I beg your pardon. My nerves are on edge. Your name sounded strange to me. I would be curious to know where you unearthed a name like that for yourself."
"The House Committee advised me. They looked in the calendar. Which do you like, they said, and I chose one."
There couldn't possibly be anything of the sort in the calendar. That's rather strange, when you've got one hanging up in the examination room. Without getting up, Philip Filipovich leaned over to the button on the wallpaper, and Zina appeared in response to his ring. The calendar from the examination room. There was a prolonged pause. When Zina returned with the calendar, Philip Filipovich asked, "Where?" "It's celebrated on the 4th of March. "Show me." Damnation. "Into the stove with it, Zina, immediately." Zina stared at him in wide-eyed fright, and left with the calendar, and the man shook his head reproachfully. "Would you be so kind as to tell me the surname?" "I'm quite happy to take my hereditary surname." "What's that?" "Your hereditary surname?" "Which is?" "Sharikov." Schwander, the chairman of the House Committee, stood in front of the desk in the study in his double-breasted leather jacket. Dr. Bomenthal sat in the armchair. The doctor's face, rosy-cheeked from the frost, he had just got back, wore an expression no less bewildered than the face of Philip Filipovich, who was sitting beside him. "What should I write?" Philip Filipovich asked impatiently. "Well now," said Schwander, "it's not a very complicated business. Write him an identity certificate, citizen professor, saying this and that the bearer of this document really is Poligrafovich Sharikov, that he was, born in your apartment." Bomenthal shifted uneasily in his armchair, perplexed. Philip Filipovich twitched one side of his moustache. Damnation. I can't imagine anything more stupid. He wasn't born at all, but simply, well, in short—" "That's your business," Schwander said in a calm, gloating voice. "Whether he was born or not, but one way or another, you carried out the experiment, Professor, and you created citizen Sharikov." "And it's all very simple," Sharikov barked from the bookshelf. He was looking at his tie reflected in the bottomless depths of the mirror. "I would kindly request you," Philip Filipovich snarled, "not to interfere in the conversation. You're quite wrong when you say it's all very simple. It is very far from simple." "I've got every right to interfere," Sharikov muttered, offended. Schwander immediately backed him up. "I beg your pardon, Professor, but Citizen Sharikov is quite correct. It is his right to take part in the discussion of his own future, especially insofar as the matter concerns important documents. A document is the most important thing in the world." At that moment, a loud, raucous ring close beside him interrupted the conversation. Philip Filipovich said "yes" into the receiver, turned red, and started shouting. "Kindly do not interrupt me with such trivial nonsense! What business is it of yours?" And he slammed the receiver down into its forked cradle. Radiant bliss flooded across Schwander's face. Flushing crimson, Philip Filipovich shouted, "In short, let's finish this." He tore a page off a notepad and dashed off a few words, then read them aloud in an irritated voice. "I hereby affirm—" Damned nonsense. "That the bearer of this document, a man produced in a laboratory experiment by means of an operation on the brain, is in need of identity papers. Damnation! I'm absolutely opposed to these idiotic papers being obtained. Signed, Professor Preobrazhensky." "That's rather strange, Professor," Schwander said resentfully. "The way that you can call official documents idiotic. I can't possibly permit the presence in the house of a tenant without documents, who hasn't been registered at the local militia department for military service either. What if there is a war with the imperialist predators?" "I'll never go fight," Sharikov suddenly yelped peevishly at the bookshelf. Schwander was caught by surprise, but he recovered quickly and remarked politely to Sharikov. "Citizen Sharikov, what you say demonstrates a supreme lack of political awareness. You have to be registered for military service." "I'll get registered, but as for fighting, sod that for a lark," Sharikov replied aggressively, adjusting his tie knot. Now it was Schwander's turn to be nonplussed. Preobrazhensky exchanged a glance of melancholy anger with Bomenthal. "How do you like that, Morals?" Bomenthal nodded significantly. I was seriously injured during the operation. Sharikov howled sullenly. Just look at the job they did on me. And he pointed to his head. There was a very fresh scar from the operation running across his forehead. Are you an individualistic anarchist? Schwander asked, raising his eyebrows. I'm disabled. I ought to have a white ticket, was Sharikov's answer to that. Well, all right. That's not important just for now, Schwander replied, astonished. The fact is that we're going to send the professor's certificate to the militia, and they'll issue you an official document. You know what? Philip Filipovich suddenly interrupted him, clearly preoccupied by some thought. Do you have a free room in the building? I'd like to buy it. Little yellow sparks glinted in Schwander's brown eyes. No, Professor. I greatly regret not. And we're not expecting to have one. Philip Filipovich clamped his lips together and said nothing. The telephone jangled again like a mad thing. Philip Filipovich didn't ask who it was. Without saying a word, he flicked the receiver out of its cradle so that it spun around for a moment or two and then just hung there on its blue cord. Everybody started. The old man's nerves have gone to pieces, Baumenthal thought, and Schwander's eyes glittered as he bowed and left the room. Sharikov followed him out, with the welts of his boots squeaking. The professor and Baumenthal were left alone. After a short silence, Philip Filipovich shook his head rapidly and said, "This is a nightmare, on my word of honor. You see? I swear to you, my dear doctor, these last 2 weeks have taken more out of me than the last 14 years. What a louse, let me tell you." There was an indistinct sound of glass cracking in the distance, then a muffled, soaring woman's shriek that instantly died away. Some evil spirit scrabbled across the wallpaper in the corridor, moving in the direction of the examination room, knocked something over in there with a crash and instantly flew back to where it had come from. Doors started banging and Darya Petrovna's faint cry echoed in the kitchen. Then Sharikov started howling. "My God, now what?" shouted Philip Filipovich, dashing to the door. "It's a cat," Baumenthal said in sudden realization and went darting out after it. They both hurtled along the corridor to the hallway and burst in, then turned into the corridor to the toilet and bathroom. Zina came darting out of the kitchen and bumped straight into Philip Filipovich. "How many times have I told you? There must be no cats here!" Philip Filipovich roared in a fury. "Where is it? Ivan Arnoldovich, for God's sake, go and reassure the patients in the reception room." "In the bathroom! The cursed devil is shut in the bathroom!" shouted Zina, panting. Philip Filipovich flung himself on the door of the bathroom, but it didn't give. "Open up this second!" In reply, something started bouncing around the walls in the locked bathroom. Basins were sent tumbling, and behind the door Sharikov's wild voice roared indistinctly. "I'll kill you right here!" Water gurgled in the pipes and began running. Philip Filipovich fell on the door and started jerking it fiercely. Darya Petrovna appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, her face contorted and bright red from the steam. Then, high up on the wall, just below the ceiling, the pane of glass that separated the bathroom from the kitchen splintered into a wormy crack, and 2 shards tumbled out of it, followed by an absolutely immense cat with tiger stripes and a blue ribbon round its neck, looking like a pre-revolutionary policeman. It fell straight onto the long serving dish on the table, cracking it in 2 lengthwise, out of the dish onto the floor, spun around on 3 paws, waving the other one as if it were dancing, and immediately squeezed through the narrow crack of the door onto the back staircase. The crack opened wider, and the cat's place was taken by an old woman's face in a headscarf. Then the old woman's skirt, scattered with white polka dots, was in the kitchen. The old woman wiped her sunken mouth with her index and middle fingers, glanced round the kitchen with swollen but piercing eyes, and said in a curious voice, "Oh, Lord Jesus!" Pale-faced Philip Filipovich strode across the kitchen and asked the old woman menacingly, "What do you want?" "I'd be interested in getting a look at the talking dog," the old woman replied ingratiatingly and crossed herself. Philip Filipovich turned even paler, stepped up close to the old woman, and said in a choking whisper,
Out of my kitchen this instant." The old woman backed towards the door and said in an offended voice,
"You're a bit too saucy altogether for my liking, citizen professor."
"Out, I say," Philip Philippovich repeated, and his eyes went as round as the owl's. He crashed the door shut behind the old woman with his own hand. "Darya Petrovna, didn't I ask you?"
"Philip Philippovich," Darya Petrovna replied despairingly, clenching her bare hands into fists, "what can I do about it? People have been breaking the door down for days now. I might as well give up trying to do anything." The water in the bathroom roared in dull menace, but no voice could be heard any longer. Dr. Bomental came in.
"Ivan Arnoldsovich, I ask you, please, how many patients are there in there?"
11, Bomental replied.
"Let them all go. I'm not going to see anyone today."
Philip Philippovich rapped on the bathroom door with his knuckle and shouted,
"Be so good as to come out immediately. Why have you locked yourself in?"
Sharikov's voice wailed in plaintive, flat tones.
What in hell's name? I can't hear you! Turn off the water! Turn off the water, will you? What has he done? I don't understand!"
Philip Philippovich exclaimed, working himself into a frenzy. Zina and Darya Petrovna had opened the kitchen door and were peering out. The noise of water running was joined by a suspicious splashing. Philip Philippovich hammered on the bathroom door again with his fists.
"There he is!"
Darya Petrovna shouted from the kitchen. Philip Philippovich went dashing in that direction. Polygraph Polygraphovich's face appeared at the broken window up under the ceiling and was thrust out into the kitchen. The features were convulsed, the eyes were tearful, and there was a scratch flaming red with fresh blood running the full length of the nose.
"Are you out of your mind?" Philip Philippovich asked. "Why don't you come out?"
Sharikov looked around in anguish and terror and replied, "I latched myself in."
"Open the lock! Don't tell me you've never seen a lock before."
"The dratted thing won't open," Polygraph replied, frightened. "Oh, my lord! He's put the safety latch on!" Zina cried, flinging her arms up in the air.
"There is a little button there,"
Philip Philippovich yelled, trying to shout over the sound of the water.
"Press it down! Press it down! Down!"
Sharikov disappeared and reappeared in the window a moment later.
"Can't see a damn thing!"
he barked in horror through the window.
"Then switch the lamp on!"
"He's gone crazy."
"The damn cat smashed the bloody lamp!"
Sharikov replied, "and I tried to grab the villain by the legs and screwed the tap out, and now I can't find it." All three of them threw their arms up in the air and froze in that position. About 5 minutes later, Bomental, Zina, and Darya Petrovna were all sitting in a row on a wet carpet rolled up into a tight tube at the foot of the door, pressing it against the crack under the door with their hindquarters, while the doorman Fyodor, carrying a lighted candle from Darya Petrovna's wedding, was climbing in through the blind window from a wooden ladder. His backside, covered in large grey checks, flashed up into the air and disappeared through the opening.
"Ooh! Ooh, ooh, ooh!"
Sharikov shouted through the roar of the water. The others heard Fyodor's voice.
"Philip Philippovich, we'll have to open it anyway. Let it spread out. We'll draw it off from the kitchen." "Open up!"
Philip Philippovich shouted angrily. The threesome got up off the carpet. Someone pressed on the bathroom door, and a wave of water immediately poured into the little corridor where it divided into 3 streams, straight ahead, into the toilet opposite, to the right into the kitchen, and to the left into the hallway. Flapping and floundering, Zina closed the door into the hallway. Fyodor came out with the water up to his ankles, smiling for some reason. He looked as if he were dressed in oilcloth, wet all over.
"Barely managed to plug it. The pressure's so strong," he explained. "Where's that creature?" Philip Philippovich asked, lifting one foot with a curse. "He's afraid to come out," Fyodor explained with a stupid grin.
"Are you going to beat me, Dad?" Sharikov whined tearfully from the bathroom.
"Blockhead!" Philip Philippovich retorted curtly.
Zina and Darya Petrovna, bare-legged, with their skirts tucked up to their knees, and Sharikov and the doorman, barefoot, with their trouser legs rolled up, swabbed the kitchen floor with wet rags and squeezed them out into dirty buckets and the sink. The abandoned stove droned. The water was escaping through the door onto the echoing staircase, straight into the stairwell and dripping into the basement. Baumenthal was balancing high on his tiptoes in a deep puddle of water on the parquet floor in the hallway and conducting negotiations through the slightly open door set on its safety chain. "The professor won't be seeing anyone today. He's not feeling well. Please move away from the door. We have a burst pipe." "But when will he be seeing people?" the voice on the other side of the door persisted. "I'd only just need a moment." "I can't say," said Baumenthal, shifting from his toes to his heels. "The professor is in bed and one of our water pipes has burst. Please, come tomorrow. Zina, my dear, wipe it up in here, or it'll pour out onto the front stairs." "The rags aren't catching it."
"We'll scoop it up with mugs," Fyodor responded. "Just a moment."
The rings at the door came one after another, and Baumenthal was already standing with his soles flat in the water. "But when's the operation?" a voice insisted and tried to squeeze through the crack. "A pipe has burst. I could go through in my galoshes." Bluish silhouettes appeared outside the door. "Impossible! Please, come tomorrow." "But I'm in the book." "Tomorrow, a disaster with a water pipe." Fyodor squirmed about in the lake at the doctor's feet, scraping away with the mug, but Sharikov, covered in scratches, thought up a new method. He rolled up a huge rag into a long tube, lay on his belly in the water, and drove it out of the hallway back towards the toilet. "What are you doing, drat you? Why are you driving it all around the flat?" Darya Petrovna asked angrily. "Pour it down the sink." "The sink's no help," Sharikov replied, trying to catch the murky water in his hands. "It's creeping out into the front entrance." A small bench emerged from the corridor with a creak, and Philip Filipovich in his blue-striped socks stretched out along it, trying to keep his balance.
"Ivan Arnoldovich, stop answering the door. Come into the bedroom. I'll give you some slippers."
"Never mind, Philip Filipovich, it's no bother."
"Stand in some galoshes."
"It doesn't matter. My feet are wet anyway."
"Oh, my God!"
Philip Filipovich exclaimed despairingly. "That rotten, damned animal!" Sharikov suddenly declared, emerging from the kitchen in a squatting position with a soup tureen in his hand. Baumenthal slammed the door, then broke down and started laughing. Philip Filipovich's nostrils flared and his eyes blazed. "Who are you talking about?" he asked, looking down on Sharikov. "Kindly, do let me know." "I'm talking about the cat, that bastard," Sharikov replied, shifty-eyed.
"You know, Sharikov,"
Philip Filipovich responded, pausing to draw breath,
"I have definitely never, ever seen a more brazen creature than you."
Baumenthal giggled.
"You,"
Philip Filipovich continued,
"are absolutely shameless. How dare you say that? You are responsible for all of this, and you have the cheek... No, this is damned impossible!"
"Sharikov, tell me, please," said Baumenthal, "how long are you going to carry on chasing after cats?"
"For shame! It's quite outrageous! You savage!"
"Why am I savage?" Sharikov responded sullenly. "I'm not any kind of savage. I can't stand it being in the apartment. All it's doing is looking for something to filch. It ate Darya's minced meat. I wanted to teach her a lesson."
"You're the one who needs to be taught a lesson," Philip Filipovich replied. "Just you take a look at your face in the mirror."
"Almost took my eye out," Sharikov responded gloomily, touching his eye with a dirty, wet hand. When the black soaking parquet had dried out a little, and all the mirrors were covered with bathroom steam and the doorbell had stopped ringing, Philip Filipovich stood in the hallway in his red Morocco leather slippers.
"There you are, Fyodor. Thank you most kindly.
Change those clothes immediately, and I tell you what, have a glass of Darya Petrovna's vodka in the kitchen."
"Thank you most kindly."
Fyodor hesitated for a moment and then said,
"One more thing, Philip Filipovich. I'm sorry, I feel really badly about it. It's just, for the window in the apartment 7, Citizen Sharikov was throwing stones.
At a cat? Philip Filipovich asked, with a face as black as thunder.
Seems it was the owner. He was threatening to take him to court. Damnation. Sharikov put his arms around their cook, and the owner tried to see him off. Well, they had a bit of a set-to. For God's sake, always tell me immediately about such things. How much do you need? 1.5.
Philip Filipovich took out 3 gleaming 50-kopeck pieces and handed them to Fyodor.
Fancy paying 1.5 rubles for a rogue like that, a flat voice said from the doorway. Why, it was him.
Philip Filipovich swung around, bit his lip, and pushed Sharikov back without speaking. He squeezed him through into the reception room and locked him in. Sharikov immediately started hammering on the inside of the door with his fists.
"Don't you dare!"
Philip Filipovich exclaimed in the voice of a man who was clearly not well.
"Now that really is something,"
Fyodor remarked emphatically.
"I've never seen brass neck like that in all my life."
Baumenthal suddenly appeared out of nowhere. "Philip Filipovich, please, do not upset yourself." The energetic man of medicine unlocked the door of the reception room, and his voice could be heard speaking inside. "What are you up to? Do you think you're in some low tavern here?"
"That's right,"
Fyodor added decisively.
"That's exactly right. He should get a clip round the ear, too."
"Oh, come now, Fyodor," Philip Filipovich mumbled sadly.
"Good heavens, I feel sorry for you, Philip Filipovich."
Chapter 7. "No, no, and no again," Baumenthal said insistently. "Be so good as to tuck it back in."
"What's wrong, God Almighty?"
Sharikov muttered in annoyance.
"Thank you, Doctor,"
Philip Filipovich said with warm feeling.
"I'm fed up of telling him off all the time."
"I'm not going to allow you to eat until you tuck it back in. Zina, take the mayonnaise from Sharikov." "What's all this take about?" Sharikov protested, upset. "I'll tuck it in straight away." He shielded his plate with his left hand, and with his right he stuffed the napkin into his collar, so that he looked like a client in a hairdresser's. "And use a fork, please," Baumenthal added. Sharikov heaved a long sigh and started fishing for pieces of sturgeon in the thick sauce. "Can I have a little bit more vodka?" he declared interrogatively. "Don't you think you've had enough?" Baumenthal inquired. "You've been going at the vodka a bit too hard just recently." "Too mean, are you?" Sharikov inquired with a sullen glance.
"Don't talk nonsense,"
Philip Filipovich intervened severely, but Baumenthal interrupted him. "Don't be concerned, Philip Filipovich. I'll deal with it. You, Sharikov, are talking rubbish, and the most disgraceful thing about it is that you talk it with such dogmatic confidence. Of course I'm not too mean to give you vodka, especially since it's not even mine, but Philip Filipovich's. It's just that it's bad for you. That's the first thing, and the second is that your behaviour is quite unseemly enough even without vodka." Baumenthal pointed to the taped mirror of the sideboard.
"Zinushka, give me some more fish, please," said the professor.
Meanwhile, Sharikov reached for the carafe and, glancing furtively at Baumenthal, poured a glass of vodka. "You should offer other people some too," said Baumenthal, "and in this order. First Philip Filipovich, then me, and yourself last." Sharikov's lips curled slightly in a faintly satirical smile, and he poured the vodka out into the glasses. "Eating with you's like being on parade," he said. "Napkin this way, tie this way, and all that beg your pardon and please thank you, and nothing right and honest about it at all. You're just torturing yourselves like under the Tsarist regime."
"And what does right and honest mean, if I might be allowed to inquire?"
Sharikov gave no reply to Philip Filipovich's question, but he raised his glass and declared, "Now I wish everything—" "And the same to you," Baumenthal responded with a certain irony. Sharikov tossed the contents of his glass down his throat, grimaced, held a piece of bread to his nose and sniffed it, and then swallowed it, and as he did his eyes filled with tears. "Past experience," Philip Filipovich suddenly declared abruptly, as though oblivious to everything around him. Baumenthal peered at him in surprise. "I beg your pardon?"
"Past experience.
Philip Filipovich repeated and shook his head bitterly. Nothing we can do about it. It's Klim. Baumental looked into Philip Filipovich's eyes, highly intrigued. Do you think so, Philip Filipovich? I don't think so. I'm certain of it. Could it really? Baumental began and stopped, squinting at Sharikov. Sharikov frowned suspiciously. Später, Philip Filipovich said quietly. Good, replied his assistant. Zina brought in the turkey. Baumental poured Philip Filipovich some red wine and offered some to Sharikov. I don't want any. I'd rather have a bit of vodka. His face had turned greasy and beads of sweat had sprung out on his forehead. He was feeling cheerful now. Even Philip Filipovich had mellowed a little after the wine. His gaze had become clearer, and he looked more benevolently at Sharikov, whose dark head seemed to sit in the napkin like a fly in the sour cream. But Baumental, having fortified himself, demonstrated his propensity to action. "Well now, what are you and I going to do this evening?" he asked Sharikov. Sharikov blinked and answered, "Let's go to the circus. That's the best thing." "The circus every day," Philip Filipovich commented good-naturedly. "That's rather boring, if you ask me. If I were you, I should go to the theatre at least once." "I'm not going to the theatre." Sharikov responded hostilely and promptly made the sign of the cross over his mouth. "Hiccuping at the table spoils other people's appetite," Baumental stated mechanically. "I beg your pardon? Why precisely do you not like the theatre?" Sharikov gazed into his empty glass as if he were looking through a pair of binoculars, thought for a moment, and thrust out his lips. "It's just playing the fool. Talk, talk, talk. Nothing but counter-revolution." Philip Filipovich leaned against the Gothic back of his chair and laughed so widely that the golden palisade in his mouth glittered. Baumental merely shook his head left and right. "You ought to try reading something," he suggested. "Or else, you know—" I read plenty as it is," Sharikov replied and poured himself half a tumbler of vodka with a rapid, predatory movement. "Zina," Philip Filipovich called out in alarm, "take the vodka away, my child. We don't need it any more." "What do you read, then?" A picture flashed rapidly through his mind. An uninhabited island, a palm tree, a man wearing an animal skin and fur cap. "I'll have to get Robinson Crusoe." "That, what's it called, Engel's correspondence with that, what's his name? Damn, with Kautsky." Baumental halted a fork with a piece of white meat on it halfway to his mouth, and Philip Filipovich spilt his wine. Sharikov took his chance and swallowed the vodka. Philip Filipovich rested his elbows on the table, gazed at Sharikov and asked, "May I be permitted to ask what you have to say about what you have read?" Sharikov shrugged. "Well, I don't agree." "With whom? With Engels or with Kautsky?" "With either of them," Sharikov replied. "That's quite remarkable, I swear to God. All those who say that any other... And for your part, what would you suggest?" "What is there to suggest? They just keep on writing and writing. A Congress, some Germans or other. Sets your head spinning. Just take the lot and divide it up." "That's what I thought you'd say," exclaimed Philip Filipovich, slapping his hand down on the tablecloth. "That's exactly what I expected." "Do you know the right way to do it?" Baumental asked, intrigued. "What do you mean, the right way?" Garrulous after the vodka, Sharikov started to explain. "There's nothing complicated about it. Just look, one man spread himself over 7 rooms. He has 40 pairs of trousers, and another's wandering the streets looking for food in the rubbish bins." "Concerning the 7 rooms, of course you are hinting at me there?" Philip Filipovich asked, narrowing his eyes haughtily. Sharikov squirmed and said nothing. "Well, all right. I've got nothing against sharing things. Doctor, how many people did you turn away yesterday?" 39, Baumental answered promptly. 390 rubles. Well, that's nothing much for 3 men. We won't count the ladies, Zina and Darya Petrovna. That means 130 rubles from you, Sharikov. Please do make an effort to pay your share.
A fine trick, that is, Sharikov replied, frightened. What's all this, For the tap and the cat,
Philip Filipovich suddenly bellowed, abandoning his pose of ironic calm.
Philip Filipovich,
Bomental exclaimed in alarm.
Wait. For the outrage for which you were responsible and which prevented me from receiving patients. It's intolerable. A man leaping about the entire apartment like a primitive savage, ripping out the taps. Who killed Madame Palasuka's cat? Who?
2 days ago, Sharikov Yubita laid on the stairs, Bomental threw in.
You stand,
growled Philip Filipovich.
Why, she slapped me round the face, Sharikov whined. My face isn't public property. Because you pinched her breasts, Bomental shouted, tipping over his wineglass. You stand on the very lowest rung of development, Philip Filipovich shouted across him. You're a creature that is not yet fully formed, mentally stunted. All your actions are savage and brutish, and in the presence of 2 men with university educations, you have the absolutely insufferable nerve, the impudence, to proffer advice on an absolutely cosmic scale that is also cosmically stupid, about how everything should be divided up. When it was you who swallowed all the tooth powder.
2 days ago, Bomental confirmed.
Now, listen here,
Philip Filipovich thundered.
Carve this into your nose, and by the way, why did you wipe the zinc ointment off it? You have to keep quiet and listen to what you're told. Learn, and try to become at least a minimally acceptable member of society. And by the way, who was the villain who gave you that book, huh?
Everyone's a villain to you, Sharikov replied in fright, stunned by this 2-pronged attack.
I can guess,
Philip Filipovich exclaimed, flushing in angry red.
Well, what of it? Svonda gave it to me. He's not a villain, so I could develop. I can see how well you're developing after Kautsky,
Philip Filipovich screeched in a shrill voice, turning yellow in the face and immediately pressing the button on the wall furiously.
Nothing could demonstrate that better than today's incident. Zina! Zina! Shouted Bomental. Zina! Yelled frightened Sharikov.
Zina came running in, pale-faced.
Zina, over in the reception room. It is the reception room.
Yes, it is, Sharikov replied submissively.
Green as vitriol it is. A green book. Oh, yes, go ahead and burn it, Sharikov exclaimed desperately. It's state property from the library. The correspondence, it's called, what's his name? Engels with that other devil. Throw it in the stove.
Zina dashed away.
I'd like to hang that Svonda, on my word I would, from the nearest branch,
exclaimed Philip Filipovich, glaring furiously at the turkey's wing.
Such an insufferable louse sitting right here in the house, like an abscess. It's bad enough that he writes all sorts of libelous nonsense in the newspapers.
Sharikov began squinting angrily and ironically at the professor. Philip Filipovich returned him a sideways glance and fell silent. Oh, it seems things are not going to turn out well in our apartment, Bomental suddenly thought prophetically. Zina brought in a round dish with a sponge cake that was reddish-brown on the right side and ruddy pink on the left, and also a coffee pot.
I'm not going to eat it,
Sharikov immediately declared in a hostile voice.
Nobody's asking you to. Behave properly. Doctor, after you.
Dinner was concluded in silence. Sharikov took a crumpled paparossa out of his pocket and started smoking. Having finished his coffee, Philip Filipovich glanced at his watch, pressed the repeater, and it gently chimed 8:15. Philip Filipovich leaned against the Gothic back of his chair in his usual manner and reached out for the newspaper on the table.
Doctor, please take him to the circus. Only for God's sake, check the program to make sure that there aren't any cats.
How could they let a rotten swine like that into the circus? Sharikov remarked morosely, shaking his head.
Why, they let all sorts in there, Philip Filipovich responded ambiguously. What have they got on?
At Solomonsky, said Baumenthal, reading from the newspaper, the force something or other, Jezemsis and this standstill man. And what is, Jezems? Philip Philippovich inquired suspiciously. God only knows. It's the first time I've seen the word. All right, then. Better see what's on at the Nikitins. We have to get everything absolutely clear. At the Nikitins, elephants and the limit of human agility. I see. What would you say to elephants, my dear Sharikov? Philip Philippovich asked Sharikov distrustfully. Sharikov took offence. Do you think I don't understand or something? A cat's a different thing altogether, but elephants are useful animals, Sharikov replied. Well, that's excellent. If they're useful, then you go and take a look at them. You must do as Ivan Arnoldovich tells you. And don't get involved in any conversations in the buffet there. Ivan Arnoldovich, I humbly request you please not to offer Sharikov any beer. 10 minutes later, Ivan Arnoldovich and Sharikov, wearing a duck-billed cap and woolen cloth coat with the collar turned up, left to go to the circus. Their apartment became quiet. Philip Philippovich was in his study. He switched on the lamp with a heavy green shade which made the atmosphere in the huge study very peaceful, and began pacing round the room. The tip of his cigar burned long and hot, with a pale green glow. The professor put his hands in his trouser pockets, and his learned brow with the retreating hairline at the sides was tormented by an oppressive thought. He kept smacking his lips gently, singing to the sacred banks of the Nile quietly through his teeth, and muttering something. Finally, he set his cigar down in the ashtray, went over to the cupboard consisting entirely of glass, and lit up the entire study with 3 extremely bright lamps on the ceiling. Philip Philippovich took a narrow jar from off the 3rd glass shelf of a cupboard and started examining it with a frown against the light of the lamps. Floating in the transparent, heavy liquid, without sinking to the bottom, was the small whitish lump extracted from the depths of Sharikov's brain. Philip Philippovich shrugged his shoulders, twisted his lips, and cleared his throat as he devoured it with his eyes, as if he wished to discern in this unsinking white lump the cause of the remarkable events that had turned life upside down in the apartment on Prochestinka Street. It is quite possible that the highly learned man did indeed discern it. In any case, after staring his fill at the appendage of the brain, he put the jar away in the cupboard, locked it, put the key in his waistcoat pocket, and then collapsed onto the leather surface of the divan, pulling his head down into his shoulders and thrusting his hands very deep into the pockets of his jacket. He puffed on another cigar for a long time, chewing its tip completely to pieces, and finally, in total solitude, still tinted green, he exclaimed like the old grey Faust, "By God, I think I'm actually going to do it!" No one answered him. All sounds in the apartment had ceased. On Obukov Lane, as everyone knows, the traffic dies down at 11 o'clock. Just very occasionally the footsteps of a late walker pattered along the pavement in the distance, somewhere beyond the curtains, and then faded away. In the study, the repeater chimed gently under Philip Philippovich's fingers in his pocket. The professor was waiting impatiently for Dr. Baumenthal and Sharikov to get back from the circus. Chapter 8. We do not know what course Philip Philippovich had decided upon. He did not undertake any exceptional measures during the week that followed, and perhaps it was even due to his inactivity that the life of the apartment was so crowded with events. About 6 days after the incident with the water and the cat, the young man from the house committee, who had turned out to be a woman, came to see Sharikov and presented him with some documents, which Sharikov immediately put away in his pocket, after which he immediately called Dr. Baumenthal. "Baumenthal?" "No, you address me formally by my name and patronymic, if you please," Baumenthal responded, his face darkening suddenly. We should note that during these 6 days the surgeon had managed to quarrel with his ward about 8 times, and the atmosphere in the rooms on Oberhof Lane was suffocating. "Then you call me by my name and patronymic too," Sharikov replied with perfectly sound logic. "No," Philip Philippovich thundered from the doorway.
I won't allow you to be addressed by that name and patronymic in my apartment. If you no longer wish to be addressed familiarly as Sharikov, then both I and Dr. Bomental will call you Mr. Sharikov." "I'm no mister. Misters are gents, and the gents are all in Paris," Sharikov barked back. "Schwander's work," shouted Philip Filipovich. "Very well, I'll settle accounts with that scoundrel. There will be no one but gentlemen addressed as Mr. in my apartment for as long as I remain in it. Otherwise, either you or I will leave here, and most likely it will be you. I shall place an advertisement in the newspaper today, and believe me, I shall find you a room." "All right, I'm not that stupid. I'm not leaving here," Sharikov replied very distinctly. "What?" asked Philip Filipovich, and the change in his expression was so startling that Bomental rushed over to him in alarm and took him gently by the sleeve. "You just stop this insolent behaviour, Monsieur Sharikov," said Bomental, raising his voice alarmingly. Sharikov took a step back and pulled 3 pieces of paper out of his pocket, green, yellow, and white. Jabbing his fingers at them, he said, "Look, a member of the Housing Association and entitled to floor space of 16 square arshins right here in apartment number 5, with responsible tenant Preobrazhensky." Sharikov thought for a moment and added a phrase that Bomental mechanically noted to himself as new. "If you please?" Biting his lip, Philip Filipovich spoke through it imprudently. "I swear I'll end up shooting the Schwander." Sharikov's acute response to these words was clearly visible in his eyes. "Philip Filipovich, vorsichtig," Bomental cautioned him. "Well, you know, when it comes to such absolutely vile behaviour," Philip Filipovich exclaimed in Russian, "bear in mind, Sharikov, Mr. Sharikov, that if you permit yourself one more such insolent outburst, I shall stop providing you with dinner or any other food at all in my home. 16 arshins, excellent, but after all, that tomfool piece of paper does not oblige me to feed you." Sharikov took fright at this, and his jaw dropped open. "I can't be left without meals," he mumbled. "Where am I going to get my grub?" "Then behave in a decent manner," both medical men said in a single voice. Sharikov quietened down significantly, and that day he didn't cause any harm to anyone apart from himself. Taking advantage of Bomental's brief absence, he purloined his razor and slashed himself across the cheekbone so badly that Dr. Bomental had to stitch up the cut, which set Sharikov howling and crying bitter tears for a long time. The following night, 2 people sat in green half-light of the professor's study. Philip Filipovich himself and his faithful, devoted Bomental. The house was already sleeping. Philip Filipovich was wearing his azure dressing gown and red slippers, and Bomental was in his shirt with blue braces. Standing on the round table between the 2 doctors, beside the plump visitor's album, were a bottle of cognac, a saucer with a sliced lemon, and a cigar box. Having filled the entire room with smoke, the men of science were heatedly discussing the latest incident. That evening Sharikov had appropriated 2 10-ruble notes that were lying under the paperweight in Philip Filipovich's study, disappeared from the apartment, and returned late, absolutely drunk. That was not all. 2 unknown individuals had turned up with him, creating an uproar on the main staircase and declaring a desire to stay overnight as Sharikov's guests. The said individuals had only departed after Fyodor, who was present at the scene with his autumn coat thrown on over his underwear, phoned the 45th militia station. The individuals had taken themselves off as soon as Fyodor put down the receiver. Following the departure of the individuals, no one was able to say what had happened to the malachite ashtray from the pier glass table in the hallway, Philip Filipovich's beaver fur hat, and his cane, the cane that happened to bear the following inscription in ornate golden script: "To our dear Philip Filipovich, with affection and respect from the grateful house surgeons on the day of..." And further on there was the Roman numeral 25. "Who are they?" asked Philip Filipovich, advancing on Sharikov with clenched fists. Staggering back and pressing against the fur coats, Sharikov muttered something about not knowing the individuals, that they weren't some kind of sons of bitches, but good people. "The most amazing thing is, they were both drunk. How did they manage it?"
Philip Filipovich asked in astonishment, gazing at the spot in the hall stand where his anniversary souvenir had once rested.
Specialists,
Fyodor explained as he went off to sleep with a ruble in his pocket. Sharikov categorically denied the business with the 2 10-ruble notes, at the same time passing some indistinct comment about him not being the only person in the apartment.
"Ah, so perhaps Dr. Bomental pinched the cash?"
Philip Filipovich inquired in a quiet voice with a fearsome undertone. Sharikov swayed, opened his bleary eyes wide, and made a suggestion.
"And perhaps Zinka took it."
"What's that?" shouted Zina, appearing in the doorway like a ghost, covering the unbuttoned blouse across her breasts with her hand.
"How dare he?"
Philip Filipovich's neck flushed red.
"Calm down, Zinusha,"
he said, holding out his hand towards her.
"Don't get upset. We'll settle all this."
Zina instantly burst into floods of tears, her mouth drooped, and her hand twitched on her collarbone.
"Zina, you should be ashamed of yourself. Who could possibly think it?"
"Stop that, for shame," Bomental said, embarrassed.
"Oh, Zina, may God forgive me, but you're a fool," Philip Filipovich began.
But at this point Zina's crying stopped of its own accord and everybody fell silent. Sharikov had started feeling sick. He banged his head against the wall and uttered a sound somewhere between I and E, something like "Ruk, ruk, 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 ruk." His face turned pale and his jaws started twitching convulsively.
"Get that scoundrel the bucket from the examination room."
And everybody started running about, attending to the ailing Sharikov. As they led him away to sleep, he staggered in Bomental's arms, swearing obscenely in a very gentle, melodic rhythm, pronouncing the words with difficulty. The whole incident had taken place at about 1 a.m, and now it was about 3, but the 2 men in the study were wide awake, the nerves wrought tight by the cognac and lemon. They had filled the room with so much smoke that it was drifting slowly in flat, dense layers, without swaying at all. Dr. Bomental, pale, with a very decisive look in his eyes, raised a wasp-waisted glass.
"Philip Filipovich," he exclaimed with heartfelt emotion, "I shall never forget how I came to you as a half-starved student, and you gave me shelter in your department. Believe me, Professor, for me you are much more than a professor and a teacher. My boundless admiration for you. Permit me to kiss you, my dear Philip Filipovich."
"Yes, my dear fellow," Philip Filipovich mumbled in confusion and rose to his feet to meet him. Bomental embraced him and kissed the bushy, tightly curled moustache with its strong smell of smoke.
"I swear to God, I'm very touched, so very touched. Thank you," said Philip Filipovich. "My dear fellow, sometimes I yell at you during operations. Pray, forgive this old man his hot temper. The fact is, I am so lonely. From Seville to Granada."
"Philip Filipovich, aren't you ashamed of yourself?" Bomental exclaimed with ardent sincerity.
"If you do not wish to offend me, please don't speak to me any more in that manner." "Well, thank you. To the sacred banks of the Nile, thank you. And I have come to love you as a gifted doctor."
"Philip Filipovich, I tell you," Bomental exclaimed passionately, jumping up from his chair and closing the door leading into the corridor more firmly, then going back and continuing in a whisper.
"This really is the only way out. Of course, I would not dare to give you advice, but, Philip Filipovich, take a look at yourself. You are absolutely worn out. It is simply not possible to carry on working like this."
"It is absolutely impossible," Philip Filipovich agreed with a sigh.
"Well, then, it's quite unthinkable," whispered Bomental. "The last time you said you were afraid for me. If only you knew, my dear Professor, how deeply your words touched me. But after all, I'm not a boy anymore, and I realize just what a dreadful turn this business could take. But I am profoundly convinced that there is no other solution.
Philip Filipovich stood up, flapped his hands at him, and exclaimed, "Don't try to tempt me. Don't even speak of it." The professor began striding around the room, setting the banks of smoke swaying. "I won't listen. You realize what will happen if they catch us. You and I won't get off with taking their social origins into account, even though it is our first conviction. You don't have the appropriate origins, do you, dear fellow?" "I damn well don't. My father was a court investigator in Vilno," Baumenthal replied mournfully, finishing his cognac. "There, see? You take my point. That's a rotten family heritage. You couldn't imagine anything worse. No, I beg your pardon, mine's even worse. My father was an archpriest in a cathedral. Merci. From Seville to Granada, in the dark silence of the nights. So, that's it, damnation." "Philip Filipovich, you're a figure of global standing, and all because of some, pardon the expression, son of a bitch. Can they really touch you, for goodness sake?" "All the more reason why I will not do it," Philip Filipovich retorted pensively, stopping and looking around at the glass cupboard. "But why?" "Because you are not a figure of global standing." "How could I even—" "There, you see? And to abandon a colleague if disaster struck, to get myself off with my global standing, I beg your pardon. I'm a Moscow student, not some kind of Sharikov." Philip Filipovich proudly squared his shoulders, so that he looked like some ancient king of France. "Philip Filipovich, Baumenthal exclaimed mournfully. "But what then? Are you now going to wait until this hooligan can be turned into a decent human being?" Philip Filipovich stopped him with a wave of his hand, poured himself some cognac, took a sip, sucked on a slice of lemon, and said, "Ivan Arnoldsovich, would you say that I have some understanding of the anatomy and physiology of, shall we say, the functioning of the human brain? What is your opinion?" "Philip Filipovich, do you need to ask?" Baumenthal replied in a voice filled with emotion, spreading his arms wide. "All right, then. Without any false modesty, I also believe that in this area I am by no means the most ignorant man in Moscow. And I believe you are the top man, not only in Moscow, but even in London, even in Oxford," Baumenthal interrupted vehemently. "Very well, then, let it be so. And now listen, future Professor Baumenthal. Nobody can do it. And that's the end of it. Don't even bother to ask. Quote my opinion. Say Preobrazhensky said so. Finita. It's Klim." Philip Filipovich suddenly exclaimed solemnly, and the cupboard chimed in reply. "Klim," he repeated. "I tell you what, Baumenthal, you are the first disciple of my school, and, in addition, you are my friend. I have become convinced of that today. So let me inform you in secret, as a friend, of course, I know you will not expose me to shame, that the old ass Preobrazhensky rushed into this operation like a third-year student. Certainly, it produced a discovery, and you know just what kind." At this point Philip Filipovich gestured mournfully with both hands in the direction of the blind on the window, evidently in allusion to the city of Moscow. "But you must bear in mind, Ivan Arnoldovich, that the only result of that discovery will be that now we shall have this Sharikov sitting right here." And Preobrazhensky slapped himself on the back of his thick neck that was prone to palsy. "Have no doubt about it. If someone," Philip Filipovich continued in a voluptuous voice, "were to lay me out here and now and give me a good flogging, I swear I'd pay them 50 rubles for it. From Seville to Granada. I'll be damned. I spent 5 years sitting there scraping appendages out of brains. You know the amount of work I did? Why, it's mind-boggling. And now I have to ask, what for? So that one fine day I could transform a perfect darling of a dog into the sort of scum that makes your hair stand on end. It's something absolutely unique. I entirely agree with you. This, Doctor, is what happens when, instead of groping his way along in parallel with nature, the researcher forces the issue and lifts the bottom of the curtain. There! You can have Sharikov and put him in your porridge for breakfast.
Philip Filipovich, but what if it had been Spinoza's brain?
Yes, snapped Philip Filipovich. Yes! If only the unfortunate dog didn't die under my knife, and you've seen what kind of operation it is. In short, I, Philip Preobrazhensky, have never done anything more difficult in my life. You could implant Spinoza's pituitary gland, or some other devils, and create an extremely advanced being out of a dog. But what's the damned point? That's the question. Explain to me, please. Why do we need to manufacture Spinoza's artificially when any woman can produce him at any time at all? After all, didn't Madame Lomonosova give birth to that famous son of hers in Kholmogory? Doctor, mankind itself takes care of this, and every year as evolution proceeds, it obstinately creates dozens of outstanding geniuses, marking them out from the general dregs as the supreme adornment of the globe. Now you understand, Doctor, why I rejected the conclusion of your case history of Sharikov. My lousy discovery, may it rot, that you make so much of is worth precisely one bent brass farthing. And don't argue, Ivan Arnoldovich, this I have already understood. You know perfectly well that I never waste my breath on idle talk. Theoretically, it is interesting. Well, all right. The physiologists will go into raptures. Moscow will go wild. But in practical terms, what have we got? Who are you dealing with now?
Preobrazhensky pointed in the direction of the examination room where Sharikov was sleeping. An outrageous scoundrel.
But who is he? Klim! Klim! The professor shouted. Klim Chugunkin!
Bomental opened his mouth.
That's what. 2 convictions, alcoholism, divided all up. The hat and the 20 rubles that disappeared.
At this point, Philip Filipovich remembered his anniversary walking cane and turned crimson.
A boar and a swine. Well, I'll find that cane. In short, the pituitary gland is a chamber of secrets that determines a particular human personality. A particular one. From Seville to Granada, Philip Filipovich roared, rolling his eyes wildly. And not a general human one. It is the brain itself in miniature. And I want nothing to do with it. Damn the thing to hell! I was concerned with something quite different. With eugenics, with improving the human species. And then I stumbled across rejuvenation. Surely you don't think I do the operations for the sake of money. I am a scientist after all.
You're a great scientist, that's what I say, said Bomental, taking a swallow of cognac. His eyes were turning bloodshot.
I wanted to carry out a little experiment after I first extracted sex hormones from the pituitary gland 2 years ago. And instead of that, look what happened. Oh, my God! All those hormones in the pituitary gland. Oh, Lord. Doctor, you see before you a hopeless blockhead. I swear to you I am completely at a loss.
Bomental suddenly rolled up his sleeves and said, squinting cross-eyed at his nose, "Then I tell you what, my dear teacher, if you do not wish to do it, I shall take the risk myself and feed him arsenic. Damn the fact that my father was a court investigator. When it comes down to it, he is yours, a creature created by your experiment." The spark went out of Philip Filipovich. He went limp, collapsed back into the armchair and said, "No, I will not allow you to do that, dear boy. I am 60 years old. I can give you advice. Never resort to a crime, no matter who it might be directed against. Keep your hands clean and live to a ripe old age."
For goodness sake, Philip Filipovich, what if that Schwanda keeps working on him? Then what will he turn into? My God, it's only now that I'm beginning to understand just how awful this Sharikov could be. Aha! Now you understand. But I realized it 10 days after the operation. So listen to me. Schwanda is the greatest fool in all of this. He doesn't understand that Sharikov is a greater threat to him than he is to me. Right now, of course, he takes every chance he gets to set him on to me, without realizing that if someone comes along and sets Sharikov onto Schwanda, he'll make mincemeat of him. I should say so. Just look at what he does to the cats. A man with a dog's heart. Oh, no, Philip Filipovich replied slowly. You, Doctor, are making an extremely serious mistake. For God's sake, don't slander the dog. The cats are only temporary. That's a matter of discipline, and 2-3 weeks, I assure you. In about a month or so, you'll stop running after them. But why not now? Ivan Arnoldovich, that's elementary. Why the deuce do you need to ask? The pituitary won't remain isolated. It will cultivate the dog's brain. Just give it time to establish itself. Even now, Sharikov is only manifesting the remnants of canine behavior. But you should understand that these cats are the very best thing that he does. Just think, the whole horror of the thing is that he no longer has a dog's heart. He has a human one. And one of the most rotten of all that exist in nature. Wrought up to the utmost degree, Baumenthal clenched his strong, thin hands into fists, squared his shoulders and said determinedly, "That's it. I'm going to kill him." "I forbid it," Philip Filipovich replied categorically. "But for goodness sake!" Philip Filipovich pricked up his ears and raised a finger in the air. "Wait a moment. I thought I heard steps." They both listened, but the corridor was quiet. "I imagined it," said Philip Filipovich, and started speaking feverishly in German. The Russian phrase criminal act appeared several times in what he said. "Just a moment," said Baumenthal, suddenly cautious, and took a step towards the door. Footsteps could clearly be heard approaching the study, and there was a voice muttering something as well. Baumenthal opened the door and recoiled in astonishment. Philip Filipovich froze in his armchair, utterly astounded. Standing there in the brightly lit rectangle of corridor was Darya Petrovna, wearing nothing but her nightdress, her face ablaze with belligerence. Both the doctor and the professor were blinded by the ample bounty of that powerful body, which in their fright they both took to be completely naked. Darya Petrovna was dragging something along in her powerful arms, and that something was resisting, squatting down on its backside and its short legs, covered with black fluff, were stumbling awkwardly across the parquet flooring. The something, of course, proved to be Sharikov, hopelessly confused, still drunk and dishevelled, and wearing nothing but his shirt. Darya Petrovna, a grandiose nude, shook Sharikov like a sack of potatoes and spoke as follows. "Take a good look at our visitor, Professor Telegrafovich. I've been married, but Zina's an innocent girl. It's a good thing I woke up when I did." At the conclusion of this speech, Darya Petrovna was abruptly overwhelmed by shame. She shrieked, covered her breasts with her hands, and went dashing away. "Darya Petrovna, excuse me, for God's sake!" Philip Filipovich called after her, recovering his wits. Baumenthal rolled the sleeves of his shirt up high and advanced on Sharikov. Glancing into his eyes, Philip Filipovich was horrified. "What are you doing, Doctor? I forbid it." Baumenthal grabbed the back of Sharikov's collar with his right hand and gave him a shake that split the cloth at the front of his shirt. Philip Filipovich rushed to intervene and began trying to tear the puny Sharikov out of the surgeon's tenacious grip. "You haven't any right to beat me," cried Sharikov, half-choked, squatting down on the floor and beginning to sober up. "Doctor!" shrieked Philip Filipovich. Baumenthal recovered a little self-control and let go of Sharikov, following which Sharikov immediately started snivelling. "Well, all right," hissed Bomental. "We'll wait until morning. I'll arrange a gala performance for him when he's sober." Then he grabbed hold of Sharikov under the arms and dragged him into the reception room to sleep. Sharikov made an attempt to kick out, but his legs refused to obey him. Philip Filipovich planted his feet wide, parting his azure skirts, raised his hands and eyes to the ceiling light in the corridor, and said, "Well, well." Chapter 9. The gala performance that Dr. Bomental had promised Sharikov did not, however, take place the following morning, owing to the fact that Polygraph Polygraphovich had disappeared from the house. Bomental was plunged into furious despair. He called himself an ass for not hiding the key to the front door, shouted that it was inexcusable, and concluded by wishing that Sharikov would fall under a bus. Philip Filipovich sat in his study with his fingers thrust into his hair and said, "I can imagine what's going on out in the street. I can just imagine it. From Seville to Granada. My God." He could still be at the House Committee, Bomental raved, and went running off. At the House Committee he quarrelled so violently with the chairman, Schwonder, that Schwonder sat down to write out a complaint to the People's Court of the Hamovniki district, shouting all the while as he did so that he was not Professor Preobrazhensky's ward's keeper, especially since only yesterday the said ward, Polygraph, had proved himself a scoundrel by taking 7 rubles from the House Committee, supposedly for the purchase of textbooks in a cooperative. Further earned 3 rubles for his trouble in searching the entire house from top to bottom. There was no trace of Sharikov anywhere. Only one thing emerged, that Sharikov had departed at dawn in a cap, a scarf and a coat, taking with him a bottle of Rowanberry vodka from the sideboard, Dr. Bomental's gloves, and all his own documents. Darya Petrovna and Zina made no secret of their tumultuous delight, and expressed the hope that Sharikov would never come back again. Sharikov had borrowed 3 rubles and 50 kopecks from Darya Petrovna the day before. "Serves you right," growled Philip Filipovich, shaking his fists in the air. The phone kept ringing the whole day long, and it rang the next day too. The doctors saw an unprecedented number of patients, and on the 3rd day the question was posed in earnest in the study of the need to inform the militia, who would have to locate Sharikov in the seething whirlpool of Moscow. And no sooner was the word militia spoken than the sacrosanct silence of Obukhov Lane was shattered by the bark and roar of a truck, and the windows in the building shuddered. Then came a confident ring at the door, and Polygraph Polygraphovich entered with extraordinary dignity, removed his cap without speaking a word, and hung his coat on the hall-stand, presenting a quite new appearance. He was wearing a second-hand leather jacket, with shabby leather trousers and tall English boots, with laces right up to the knees. An overwhelming stench of cats immediately filled the entire hallway. As if by command, Preobrazhensky and Bomental crossed their arms on their chests, positioned themselves by the lintel, and waited to see what Polygraph Polygraphovich had to say to them. Polygraph stroked his coarse hair, cleared his throat, and looked around in a way that made it clear that he wanted to conceal his embarrassment behind a screen of vulgar familiarity. "Philip Filipovich," he said when he finally began to speak, "I have taken a job." Both doctors made an indistinct dry sound in their throats and shuffled their feet. Preobrazhensky was the first to recover his composure. He held out his hand and said, "Give me the document." The document said, "The bearer of this document, Comrade Polygraph Polygraphovich Sharikov, is genuinely the head of the sub-department for pest control, ridding the city of stray animals, cats and others, and the Moscow Department of Communal Services." "I see," Philip Filipovich said wearily. "But who got you the job?" "Ah, but I can guess." "Well, yes, Schwonder," replied Sharikov. "If I may ask, why do you smell so revoltingly?" Sharikov sniffed at his jacket anxiously. "Why, of course it smells. You know, it's the job. Well, yesterday we were strangling cats. strangling them, on and on. Philip Filipovich shuddered and looked at Bomental, whose eyes were like two black gun barrels aimed point-blank at Sharikov. Without any preliminaries, he moved towards Sharikov and grabbed him by the throat with confident ease. "Help!" squeaked Sharikov, turning pale. "Doctor?" "I won't permit myself to overstep the mark, Philip Filipovich, don't you worry." Bomental responded in a voice of iron and howled. "Zina and Darya Petrovna?" They appeared in the hallway. "Now repeat after me," said Bomental, pressing Sharikov's throat ever so slightly further back towards the fur coat. "Please forgive me." "All right, I'll say it," Sharikov replied in a hoarse voice, totally defeated. Then he suddenly filled his lungs with air, gave a jerk and tried to shout help. But the shout never emerged, and now his head was completely sunk into the fur coat. "Doctor, I implore you." Sharikov nodded his head to indicate that he submitted and would repeat the words. "Please forgive me, my dear Darya Petrovna and Zinaida—" "Prokofievna," Zina whispered in fright. "Prokofievna," Sharikov said hoarsely, gasping for air. "For taking the liberty—" "Liberty?" "Of my vile escapade during the night while I was drunk." "Drunk?" "I will never do it again." "It again?" "Let him go. Let him go, Ivan Arnoldsovich." Both women started pleading simultaneously. "You'll strangle him." Bomental released Sharikov and said, "Is the truck waiting for you?" "No," Polygraph replied politely. "It only brought me." "Zina, tell the truck to go. Now bear in mind the following. You have come back again to Philip Filipovich's apartment?" "Where else can I go?" Sharikov replied timidly, with his eyes wandering. "Excellent. You just be as meek as a little lamb. Otherwise, you'll have to answer to me for every single outrage. Is that clear?" "Yes," replied Sharikov. Throughout the coercion of Sharikov, Philip Filipovich remained silent. He huddled against the lintel, looking strangely pitiful, and chewed on a fingernail, with his gaze lowered to the parquet floor. Then he suddenly raised his eyes to Sharikov and asked in a dull, mechanical voice, "What do you do with those cats that you kill?" "They'll go for coats," replied Sharikov, "and they'll make protein out of them for the workers' credit program." After this, peace descended on the apartment and continued for 2 days. Polygraph Polygrafovich went away in the truck in the morning, appeared in the evening, and ate his dinner quietly in the company of Philip Filipovich and Bomental. Even though Bomental and Sharikov slept in the same room, the reception room, they did not talk to each other, and Bomental was the first to become dispirited. After those 2 days, a slim young woman with her eyes outlined in black and cream-coloured stockings appeared in the apartment and became very embarrassed at the sight of its magnificence. As she was following Sharikov in her threadbare little coat, she bumped into the professor in the hallway. The professor halted, perplexed, screwed up his eyes and asked, "And who might you be?" "We're getting married. She's our typist. She's going to live with me. Bomental will have to be moved out of the reception room. He's got his own apartment," Sharikov explained in an extremely unpleasant, sullen voice. Philip Filipovich blinked, thought for a moment, looking at the crimson-faced young woman, and then asked her very politely, "Would you mind joining me in my study for a moment?" "And I'll go with her too," Sharikov said with suspicious alacrity. Bomental instantly appeared out of nowhere. "I'm afraid not," he said. "The professor will have a talk with the lady, and you and I will stay here." "I don't want to," Sharikov said spitefully, making to dash after Philip Filipovich and the young woman, whose face was blazing in shame. "No, I'm afraid not." Bomental took hold of Sharikov's wrist, and they went into the examination room. Nothing was heard from the study for about 5 minutes, and then suddenly there was the sound of the young woman sobbing. Philip Filipovich was standing by the desk, and the young woman was crying into a dirty lace handkerchief.
The scoundrel told me he'd been wounded in battle, the young lady sobbed. He's lying, Philip Filipovich replied adamantly. He shook his head and continued, I feel genuinely sorry for you, but you can't do that with just anybody, simply for the sake of your job. My child, why, it's scandalous. I'll tell you what. He opened the drawer of the desk and took out 3 30-ruble notes. I'll poison myself, the young woman cried. Every day in the canteen it's salt beef. And he threatens me. He says he's a Red Army commander. He says with me you live in a luxurious apartment. Pineapples every day. I've got a kind personality, he says. It's only cats that I hate. He took my ring as a keepsake. Well, well, a kind personality. From Seville to Granada, Philip Filipovich muttered. You need to wait a while. You're still so young. Was it really that same gateway? Look, take the money when someone offers you a loan, snapped Philip Filipovich. Then the doors opened solemnly, and at Philip Filipovich's invitation Baumental led in Sharikov, with his eyes roaming around in his head and the fur on his head standing up like a brush. Scoundrel, the young woman said with a glare from her smudged, tear-stained eyes and a glint of her stripy powdered nose. Where did you get that scar on your forehead? Do try to explain to this lady, Philip Filipovich said ingratiatingly. Sharikov decided to go for broke. I was wounded at the front, fighting Kolchak, he barked. The young woman stood up and walked out, crying loudly. Stop that! Philip Filipovich shouted after her. Wait, the ring, if you please, he said, addressing Sharikov. Sharikov resignedly removed a hollow ring with an emerald from his finger. All right, he suddenly said spitefully. I won't let you forget this. Tomorrow I'll make sure you get the sack. Don't be afraid of him, Baumental shouted after her. I won't let him do anything. He swung around and gave Sharikov a look that made him shy away and bang the back of his head against the bookcase. What's her surname? Baumental asked him. Her surname, he roared, and suddenly he was wild and terrifying. Vasnitsova, Sharikov replied, looking around for a way to slip out. Every day, said Baumental, grabbing hold of the collar of Sharikov's jacket, I will personally inquire at the pest control department whether Citizeness Vasnitsova has been sacked. And if I find out that she has been sacked, I'll shoot you right here with my own hands. Beware, Sharikov. I'm speaking to you in plain Russian. Sharikov stared fixedly at Baumental's nose. I can lay my hands on revolvers too, Polygraph muttered, but very feebly. Then with a sudden, deft, squirming movement he darted out of the door. Beware! Baumental's shout echoed after him. For that night and half of the next day the silence hung thick, like a dark cloud before the storm. Nobody said anything. But the day after that, when Polygraph Polygrafovich, who had been stung by a dark presentiment in the morning, rode away, sullen and gloomy, on the truck to his job, Professor Preobrazhensky saw one of his former patients at a most unusual hour, a fat, tall man in a military uniform. The man had obstinately persisted in his request to be seen, and his request had been granted. On entering the study, he clicked his heels politely to the professor. "Have your pains come back, dear fellow?" asked the haggard Philip Filipovich. "Please, sit down." "Merci. No, Professor," the visitor replied, setting his helmet down on the corner of the desk. "I'm most grateful to you. I've come to see you on a different matter, Philip Filipovich. Since I respect you so highly, to warn you. It's obvious nonsense. He's simply a scoundrel." The patient reached into his briefcase and took out a sheet of paper. "It's a good thing it was reported directly to me." Philip Filipovich set his pince-nez on his nose above his spectacles and started reading. He muttered to himself for a long time, the expression on his face changing every second. "And also threatening to kill the chairman of the House Committee, Comrade Schwander. which makes it clear that he keeps a firearm, and he makes counter-revolutionary speeches, and he even ordered his menial Zinaida Prokofyevna Bunina to burn Engels in the stove, as an obvious Menshevik. Him and his assistant Ivan Arnoldovich Bomental, who lives in his flat in secret and unregistered. I certify the signature of the head of the Sub-Department of Pest Control, P.P. Sharikov, chairman of the House Committee Schwonder, Secretary Petrukin. "Will you allow me to keep this?" asked Philip Filipovich, breaking out in red blotches. "Or, I'm sorry, perhaps you need it, to set the legal wheels in motion?" "Come now, Professor," the patient replied, flaring his nostrils in serious offence. "You really do regard us with great contempt. He started puffing himself up like a turkey cock. I'm sorry, my dear fellow," Philip Filipovich muttered. "Forgive me. I really did not mean to offend you." "We know how to read documents, Philip Filipovich." "My dear fellow, don't be angry. He really has completely worn me out." "I can believe it," said the patient, entirely recovered. "But what scum he is! It would be interesting to get a look at him. There are absolute legends circulating about you in Moscow." Philip Filipovich merely waved his hand despairingly. That was when the patient noticed that the professor had begun to stoop, and his hair even seemed to have turned grey just recently. Once the crime was ripe, it fell like a stone, the way things usually happen. Polygraph Polygrafovich returned in the truck with a heavy, nagging feeling in his heart. Philip Filipovich's voice invited him into the examination room. Surprised, Sharikov went in and glanced with a vague fear into the gun barrel of Bomental's face, and then at Philip Filipovich. The assistant was shrouded in a black cloud, and his left hand with the papirosa trembled slightly on the gleaming arm of the obstetrical chair. Speaking with malevolent composure, Philip Filipovich said, "Collect your things now. Trousers, coat, everything that you need, and get out of the apartment." "What are you talking about?" asked Sharikov, genuinely surprised. "Get out of the apartment. Today," Philip Filipovich repeated in a monotone, squinting down at his fingernails. Some kind of evil spirit took possession of Polygraph Polygrafovich. Obviously doom was already stalking him, and fate was already standing at his back. He flung himself headlong into the embrace of the inevitable and barked with abrupt malice. "What's going on here, really? Do you think I can't get myself justice against you? I'm sitting on 16 arshins here, and I'm going to stay sitting on them." "Clear out of the flat," Philip Filipovich hissed cordially. Sharikov invited his own death. He raised his left hand with its bitten nails, and abominable stench of cats, and showed Philip Filipovich a gesture of crude defiance. And then, with his right hand, he took a revolver out of his pocket for the dangerous Bomental. Bomental's papirosa dropped like a falling star, and a few seconds later Philip Filipovich was dashing in horror from the cupboard to the couch and back, skipping over the broken glass. Lying stretched out on the glass, wheezing, was the head of the Sub-Department of Pest Control, with a Surgeon Bomental perched on his chest, smothering him with a small white cushion. A few minutes later, Dr. Bomental, his face looking as if it were not his own, walked through to the front entrance and pasted up the following note beside the button of the doorbell. "Due to illness, the professor is not receiving patients today. Please do not disturb him by ringing." He cut the wire of the doorbell with a gleaming penknife, examined the bloody scratches on his own face in the mirror, and also the faint trembling of his hands. Then he appeared in the doorway of the kitchen and told the alarmed Zina and Darya Petrovna, "The professor requests you not to leave the apartment at all." "All right," Zina and Darya Petrovna answered timidly. "Permit me to lock the door to the back entrance and take the key," said Bomental, hiding behind the door and covering his face with his hand. "This is a temporary measure, not because I do not trust you, but someone will come, and you will not be able to resist opening up, and we must not be disturbed. We're busy." "All right," the women replied, instantly turning pale. Bomental locked the back door, locked the front door, locked the door from the corridor into the hallway, and his footsteps disappeared into the examination room.
Silence fell on the apartment and crept into every corner of it. Twilight came creeping, vile and watchful, in short, darkness. True, afterwards the neighbours across the courtyard said that on that evening all the lights were burning in the windows of the examination room overlooking the courtyard, and that they even saw the professor's own white cap. This is hard to believe. Although, when it was all over, Zina did mention in her prattle that after Bomental and the professor came out of the examination room, Ivan Arnoldovitch had frightened her to death beside the fireplace in the study. Apparently he was squatting down there, burning one of his own handwritten notebooks with a blue binding in the hearth, one from the pile in which the case histories of the professor's patients were recorded. Supposedly the doctor's face was absolutely green and scratched completely to ribbons, and Philip Philippovich was not like himself that evening either. And as well as that, but then perhaps the innocent girl from the Prochestenka apartment could be lying. One thing we can vouch for. That evening the apartment was filled with an absolute and quite horrific silence. Epilogue. Exactly 10 nights after the battle in the examination room in Professor Preobrazhensky's apartment on Obukhov Lane, there was a sharp ring at the door. "Criminal militia and investigator! Be so good as to open the door!" There was the sound of running footsteps and knocking. People started coming in, and suddenly there was a crowd of them in the glittering reception room with its bright lamps and newly glazed cupboards. 2 men in militia uniform, one in a black coat with a briefcase, the spiteful and pale chairman Schwonder, the woman youth, the doorman Fyodor, Zina, Darya Petrovna, and the half-dressed Bomental, shamefacedly concealing his neck without a tie on it. The door from the study opened to admit Philip Philippovich. He emerged wearing the azure dressing gown familiar to everyone, and everyone could immediately see that Philip Philippovich had put on a lot of weight during the last week. It was the former imperious and energetic Philip Philippovich, full of dignity, who appeared before his nocturnal guests and apologized for being in his dressing gown. "Don't worry about that, Professor," the man in civilian clothes said in a very embarrassed voice, and then paused before continuing. "This is very unpleasant. We have a warrant to search your apartment, and, the man squinted at Philip Philippovich's moustache, "to make an arrest, depending on the result." Philip Philippovich narrowed his eyes and asked, "But what is the charge, if I may make so bold as to ask? And whom are you to arrest?" The man scratched his cheek and began reading from a sheet of paper taken from his briefcase. "Preobrazhensky, Bomental, Zinaida Bunina, and Darya Ivanova are charged with the murder of the head of the sub-department of pest control of the Moscow Department of Communal Services, Polygraf Polygrafovich Sharikov." Zina's sobbing drowned his final words. There was a stirring in the room. "I don't understand a thing," Philip Philippovich replied with a regal twitch of his shoulders. "What Sharikov are you talking about? Oh, forgive me. You mean my dog, the one I operated on?" "I beg your pardon, Doctor, not the dog, but when he was already a man. That's the point." "You mean he could talk?" asked Philip Philippovich. "That's not enough to make him a man, but then that's not important. Sharik is still alive, and certainly nobody has killed him." "Professor," the man in black began in great surprise, "then he will have to be produced. It is 10 days now since he disappeared, and I'm sorry, but the facts do not look good." "Dr. Bomental, be so good as to show Sharik to the investigator," Philip Philippovich instructed, taking possession of the warrant. Dr. Bomental went out with a crooked smile on his face. When he came back and whistled, a strange-looking dog came bounding out after him through the door of the study. It was bald in patches, but in patches its coat was growing. It walked out like a trained circus performer on its hind legs, and then went down on all fours and looked around. A deadly silence congealed in the reception room like jelly. The nightmarish dog with the crimson scar on its forehead stood back up on its hind legs, smiled, and sat down in an armchair. The second militiaman suddenly crossed himself in broad sweeps and stepped back, instantly crushing both of Zina's feet. Without ever closing his mouth, the man in black said,
But how could this be? He worked in pest control. I did not send him to work there, replied Philip Filipovich. I believe that Mr. Schwander recommended him, if I'm not mistaken. I don't understand a thing, the man in black said in confusion, and turned to the first militiaman. Is this him? Yes, the militiaman replied soundlessly. That's definitely him. That's him, said Fyodor's voice. Only the bastard's turned hairy again. He used to talk. And he still does talk, only less and less, so make the most of the opportunity. He will soon fall silent altogether. But why? The man in black asked quietly. Philip Filipovich shrugged. Science does not yet know any way of turning animals into human beings. This was my attempt, but an unsuccessful one, as you can see. He spoke for a while and then began to revert to his original primitive condition. Atavism. Don't use rude words. The dog suddenly barked from the armchair and stood up. The man in black abruptly turned pale, dropped his briefcase and began slumping sideways. A militiaman grabbed him from one side and Fyodor from behind. There was a confused bustling in which the three most audible phrases spoken were, Philip Filipovich, Valerian, he's fainted. Dr. Baumenthal, I will personally throw Schwander down the stairs if he ever appears in Professor Preobrazhensky's apartment again. And Schwander, I request that those words be entered in the proceedings. The pleated grey accordions of the pipes rumbled. The blinds hid the dense Prachestinka night with its solitary star. The supreme being, the solemn benefactor of dogkind, sat in the armchair, and the dog Sharik lay on the carpet, leaning against the leather divan. In the mornings, the March mist gave the dog headaches, which tormented him along the circular line of the stitches on his head, but by the evening the warmth had cured them. And at that very moment the pain was easing, and the thoughts flowing through the dog's head were smooth and warm. I was so lucky, he thought, dozing. Simply incredibly lucky. I'm established in this apartment now. I'm absolutely certain that there must be some dark secret in my background. There has to be a Newfoundland there somewhere. My grandmother was a trollop, God rest the old woman's soul. They slashed my head open all over for some reason, right enough, but that will soon pass. No need to pay attention to that. There was a dull clinking of bottles in the distance. The bitten one was tidying the cupboards in the examination room, but the grey-haired magician sat there singing quietly. To the sacred banks of the Nile. The dog saw terrible things. The solemn man lowering hands in slippery gloves into a vessel and taking out a brain. An obstinate man, persistent, always trying to get at something in it, cutting, examining, screwing up his eyes and singing, To the sacred banks of the Nile.